Welcome, weary wanderers of the night, to the darkest corners of Hawkins mythology, where shadows breathe and time itself bends to malevolent will. Tonight, we trace the complete transformation of Henry Creel, from sensitive child to cosmic horror, following each twisted turn that led an ordinary boy into becoming Vecna, the architect of interdimensional nightmares. From the quiet suburban streets of 1950s Indiana to the writhing depths of the Upside Down, we'll explore every moment that shaped this tragic villain's journey toward ultimate darkness. Let these whispered chronicles of corruption and power carry you gently into dreams, where monsters are merely stories and dawn promises safer shores. The phenomenon that would ultimately consume Hawkins began not with supernatural forces or interdimensional rifts, but with the quiet desperation of a family seeking redemption through geography. In 1959, when the American dream still gleamed with the promise of suburban perfection, the Creel family made their fateful journey to what they believed would be their salvation. A sprawling house in the newly developed outskirts of Hawkins, Indiana, where manicured lawns and white picket fences promised to cure whatever darkness had taken root in their eldest child. Henry Edward Creel had entered the world in 1947, born into the shadow of a global conflict that had reshaped humanity's understanding of evil and the lengths to which civilized people could descend when fear became their compass. His father, Victor Creel, carried within his memory the weight of decisions made in wartime France, where the distinction between enemy and innocent had blurred beyond recognition in the smoke of burning buildings and the cries of the dying. His mother, Virginia, possessed the keen intuition that mothers develop when they sense that something fundamental has gone wrong with their child. Though she lacked the vocabulary to articulate the nature of the wrongness that seemed to emanate from Henry like heat from a fever, young Alice Creel represented everything that Henry was not: innocent, trusting, delighted by simple pleasures, and convinced that the world held nothing but wonder for those brave enough to explore its mysteries. Where Henry saw manipulation and weakness in human behavior, Alice perceived kindness and possibility. Where he found evidence of humanity's fundamental corruption, she discovered reasons for hope and celebration. This stark contrast between siblings would prove to be both prophetic and tragic, as Henry's perception of his sister as naive and vulnerable would eventually justify actions that no amount of philosophical reasoning could excuse. The specific catalyst for the Creel family's relocation to Hawkins remained shrouded in the kind of deliberate ambiguity that families employ when the truth proves too painful or embarrassing to acknowledge directly. Victor would later describe their move in terms that reflected the broader social migration patterns of post-war America, explaining how countless families were abandoning urban centers for the promise of suburban safety and prosperity. The narrative he constructed emphasized economic opportunity and social advancement, the natural progression of American families seeking their rightful place in the expanding middle class that defined the decade's aspirations. Virginia's great-uncle had recently passed away, leaving behind a modest but significant inheritance that made possible the kind of lifestyle that previous generations could only have dreamed of achieving. The money arrived at precisely the moment when the family needed a fresh start, as if fate itself had conspired to provide them with the resources necessary to escape whatever circumstances had made their previous life untenable. The inheritance represented more than financial security. It offered the possibility of reinvention, the chance to become the family they had always believed they could be, if only they could find the right environment in which to flourish. Alice's reaction to their new home captured the magic that suburban developers had worked so carefully to create. Her exclamation that the house seemed like something from a fairy tale reflecting the deliberate enchantment that architects and planners had woven into these new communities. The scale of their new residence amazed her. Rooms that seemed to stretch endlessly, closets large enough to serve as playrooms, windows that framed views of carefully cultivated landscapes, where every tree and shrub had been positioned to maximize the impression of natural beauty tamed by human ingenuity. Yet beneath Victor's publicly optimistic explanation for their relocation lay a darker truth that he would never voluntarily acknowledge: the desperate hope that a change of scenery might somehow cure what teachers and medical professionals had begun to diagnose as Henry's fundamental brokenness. The boy who should have been thriving in the prosperous aftermath of American victory instead seemed to wither under the weight of expectations that other children his age carried with ease and enthusiasm. His teachers described him as bright but troubled, possessed of an intelligence that seemed to turn inward rather than reaching toward the light of learning and growth that characterized healthy childhood development. The medical establishment of 1959 lacked the sophisticated understanding of childhood psychology that later generations would take for granted, leaving professionals to rely on terms like different and broken that describe symptoms without offering meaningful insight into causes or potential treatments. Henry's behavior problems were documented in clinical language that reduced a complex human being to a series of concerning observations: his difficulty fitting in with other children, his preference for solitary activities, his tendency toward what educators euphemistically called inappropriate responses to social situations. The historical context surrounding Henry's early development cannot be separated from the broader atmosphere of fear and suspicion that characterized the early Cold War period, when American society had become hyper-vigilant about any form of nonconformity that might indicate dangerous foreign influence or ideological corruption. The Red Scare that gripped the nation during these years created an environment where unusual behavior in children was not merely concerning but potentially threatening, as if communist agents might be recruiting elementary school students to undermine American values through playground sedition. This paranoid atmosphere made Henry's natural inclination towards solitude and his difficulty with conventional social interactions seem not merely problematic, but possibly sinister, as if his inability to embrace normal childhood activities indicated some form of anti-American sentiment that required correction through relocation and environmental modification. The idea that weird behavior back then carried implications that extended far beyond individual psychology helps explain why the Creel family felt such urgent pressure to address Henry's differences through dramatic measures rather than simply accepting them as part of his unique personality. The irony of their situation lay in the fact that Henry himself possessed no enthusiasm for the suburban experiment that his parents had embraced with such desperate hope, where they saw opportunity for transformation and healing. He perceived merely a change of location for the same fundamental problems that had made his previous life unbearable. His response to their optimistic plans carried the bitter wisdom of someone who understood that internal darkness could not be cured through external modifications, no matter how carefully designed or expensively purchased. Henry's prescient observation that the world would be no different in Hawkins than it had been anywhere else reflected an understanding of human nature that far exceeded his chronological age, though this insight was corrupted by the cynicism that would eventually metastasize into something far more dangerous than simple disillusionment. His conviction that geographic relocation represented nothing more than cosmetic treatment for systemic problems revealed a mind already beginning to separate itself from the hopeful assumptions that sustained most people through the ordinary difficulties of existence. The discovery of the Black Widow spider nest in the bathroom vent marked the beginning of Henry's conscious identification with creatures that lived outside the warm circles of family and community that defined normal human existence. His fascination with these arachnids stemmed not from scientific curiosity but from recognition. The understanding that he had found kindred spirits in beings that survived through isolation, predation, and the kind of ruthless efficiency that sentimental humans preferred not to acknowledge as part of the natural order. His description of spiders as deeply misunderstood creatures reflected his own sense of alienation from a society that seemed incapable of appreciating the logic and necessity of behaviors that appeared cruel or antisocial to those who lacked the courage to see reality clearly. The Black Widows represented everything that Henry admired about the natural world. They were solitary by choice rather than circumstance. They eliminated weakness without regard for the emotional attachments that clouded human judgment, and they maintained perfect balance within their ecosystems through methods that squeamish observers might condemn as brutal, but which Henry recognized as elegantly efficient. The hours he spent in the attic studying his captured specimens and creating detailed drawings of their anatomy and behavior patterns established a sanctuary where his true nature could emerge without the constant pressure to conform to expectations that made no sense to him. In that dusty space, above the family's living quarters, surrounded by jars containing creatures that most people would destroy on sight, Henry found the peace that eluded him in every other aspect of his existence. His philosophical framework began to crystallize around the observation that spiders served as the ultimate predators in their miniature universes, maintaining ecological balance by feeding on the weak and preventing the kind of overpopulation that would ultimately destroy the environment that sustained all life. This understanding of natural selection as a positive force that required the elimination of inferior specimens would gradually expand to encompass his view of human society and his eventual role as an agent of necessary correction. The grandfather clock that would later become his signature weapon first captured Henry's attention as an artifact of human civilization's obsession with artificial time structures that bore no relationship to the natural rhythms that governed authentic existence. His ability to manipulate its hands through focused concentration represented more than simple telekinesis. It symbolized his growing power to impose his will upon the arbitrary systems that others accepted without question. The first manifestation of abilities that would eventually allow him to reshape reality according to principles that transcended conventional morality. As Henry's understanding of his unique capabilities expanded beyond simple object manipulation into the far more complex realm of psychological infiltration, he began to perceive the thoughts and memories of his family members with a clarity that revealed the hypocrisy and self-deception that lurked beneath their carefully maintained facades of normalcy and respectability. This newfound insight into the hidden darkness that motivated supposedly good people confirmed his growing conviction that human civilization represented nothing more than an elaborate performance designed to conceal the same predatory instincts that spiders expressed with honest directness. The discovery that he could create convincing hallucinations within other people's minds opened possibilities for experimentation that would have terrified a child with normal moral development, but which Henry approached with systematic curiosity of a natural scientist investigating the properties of newly discovered phenomena. His ability to force family members to experience visions that seemed completely real to them, despite being entirely products of his imagination, demonstrated a form of power that transcended physical manipulation to encompass the very nature of perceived reality. The psychological implications of possessing such abilities at such a young age cannot be overstated, as Henry's developing sense of identity became inextricably linked with his capacity to control and manipulate others in ways that normal human beings could never hope to achieve. The temptation to use these powers for personal amusement or advantage proved irresistible to a child who already felt disconnected from the moral constraints that governed conventional behavior, setting him on a path toward corruption that would accelerate with each successful demonstration of his supernatural capabilities. The weight of societal expectations during the 1950s created an environment where any deviation from prescribed norms carried implications that extended far beyond individual psychology to encompass questions of national sanity, security, and ideological loyalty, making Henry's differences seem not merely problematic, but potentially dangerous to the social order that defined American prosperity and power during this crucial period in the nation's development. The black widow spiders that Henry Creel discovered, nestled within the bathroom vent of his family's New Hawkins home, represented far more than a simple childhood fascination with creepy crawlies. They embodied his first conscious recognition of kinship with creatures that existed outside the warm circles of community and connection that defined normal human existence. These arachnids, with their sleek obsidian bodies and methodical hunting patterns, spoke to something fundamental in Henry's developing psyche, offering him a mirror in which he could finally see his own nature reflected without the distorting lens of social expectations or parental disappointment. The solitary nature of these creatures resonated with Henry's own profound isolation, though his alienation stemmed not from circumstance but from choice, from a growing conviction that the company of others only served to highlight the vast gulf between his understanding of reality and the comfortable illusions that sustained most people through their ordinary lives. Where other children might have recoiled in fear or disgust from discovering such creatures in their home, Henry experienced something approaching religious revelation, the sudden understanding that he had found his true spiritual family among beings that most humans would destroy without a moment's hesitation or regret. His patient observation of their behavior patterns revealed a level of efficiency and purposefulness that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic emotionalism that characterized human interactions. The way his parents stumbled through their daily routines, driven by impulses they couldn't name and desires they couldn't satisfy. The spiders operated according to principles that transcended the messy complications of sentiment and attachment. They identified prey. They struck with lethal precision. They consumed what they needed, and they moved on without the burden of guilt or second-guessing that plagued creatures cursed with unnecessary complexity. The systematic collection of these specimens in mason jars that he carefully labeled and arranged in the attic created Henry's first laboratory, a private sanctuary where he could pursue studies that no teacher would ever approve and no parent would ever understand. Each jar became a miniature universe under his absolute control, where he could observe the pure expression of predatory instinct without the interference of well-meaning adults who would inevitably try to convince him that his fascination was unhealthy or inappropriate for a child his age. The detailed drawings that Henry created during these observation sessions demonstrated an artistic talent that might have been channeled into more conventional pursuits under different circumstances, but which found its truest expression in documenting the anatomy and behavior of creatures that embodied the ruthless efficiency he increasingly admired. His sketches captured not just the physical characteristics of his subjects, but something deeper, the essence of beings that had evolved beyond the need for the emotional complications that made human existence so unnecessarily difficult and painful. These artistic endeavors also revealed Henry's growing identification with the role of predator rather than prey. His understanding that the natural world was divided into those who consumed and those who were consumed, with very little middle ground for creatures that lacked the courage to embrace their true nature. The spiders had no choice in their predatory behavior. It was written into their genetic code, an unavoidable expression of their evolutionary purpose. But Henry recognized that humans possessed the terrible freedom to choose their position in the cosmic hierarchy, and most chose poorly. His philosophical framework began to crystallize around the observation that black widow spiders served as perfect agents of natural selection, eliminating weaker specimens and maintaining ecological balance through methods that squeamish observers might condemn as cruel, but which Henry increasingly understood as necessary corrections to a world that had become dangerously overpopulated with inferior examples of life. The spiders felt no guilt about their role as eliminators because guilt was a human invention designed to prevent the kind of honest assessment of worth and weakness that healthy ecosystems required. The revelation that humans had disrupted this natural balance through their sentimental attachment to preserving life regardless of its quality or contribution became a central element of Henry's emerging worldview. The understanding that civilization had become a form of cosmic disease that prevented the universe from maintaining the elegant efficiency that characterized properly functioning systems. Human concepts of mercy and compassion, viewed through this lens, were not virtues but symptoms of a species that had lost touch with the fundamental laws that governed all existence. This philosophical evolution occurred gradually, emerging through countless hours of solitary contemplation in the attic sanctuary, where Henry felt free to follow his thoughts to their logical conclusions, without the constant pressure to conform to expectations that made no sense to him. The other children in his school seemed content to accept the arbitrary rules and meaningless rituals that adults imposed upon them. But Henry possessed a clarity of vision that made such compliance impossible to sustain. The discovery of his telekinetic abilities began with the grandfather clock that dominated the Creel family's living room, its ornate wooden case and brass pendulum representing everything that Henry had come to despise about human attempts to impose artificial structure upon the natural flow of time and experience. The clock measured duration according to mechanical principles that bore no relationship to the organic rhythms that governed authentic existence, dividing each day into identical segments that ignored the reality that some moments contained vastly more significance than others. His initial manipulation of the clock's hands occurred during one of those suspended moments when the rest of the family was occupied elsewhere, and Henry found himself alone with his growing sense of disconnection from the world around him. The ability to move the hands through focused concentration felt as natural as breathing, though far more satisfying than any automatic biological function could ever be. Here was proof that the arbitrary systems that others accepted without question were merely suggestions that could be overruled by someone with sufficient will and understanding. The progression from simple object manipulation to the far more complex realm of psychological infiltration occurred over weeks and months of careful experimentation, as Henry discovered that the same focused intention that allowed him to control physical objects could be directed toward the minds of other people with results that were both fascinating and terrifying. The ability to peer into the thoughts and memories of his family members revealed depths of hypocrisy and self-deception that confirmed his growing conviction that most human beings lived in a state of willful blindness regarding their own nature and motivations. His parents, who presented themselves to the world as pillars of moral respectability and civic virtue, harbored secrets and shame that made their public personas seem like elaborate theatrical performances, designed to deceive not just others but themselves. His father's war experiences had left psychological scars that manifested in ways Victor would never acknowledge, while his mother's growing awareness of Henry's true nature filled her with a terror that she could never express directly without admitting that she had given birth to something that defied every assumption she held about childhood innocence and maternal love. The power to create convincing hallucinations within other people's consciousness opened possibilities for experimentation that Henry approached with the systematic curiosity of a natural scientist investigating newly discovered phenomena. His ability to force family members to experience visions that seemed completely real despite being entirely products of his imagination demonstrated a form of control that transcended physical manipulation to encompass the very nature of perceived reality. These early experiments in psychological manipulation typically involved relatively minor incidents, making his mother see spiders emerging from the bathtub drain when she was already anxious about the cleanliness of their new home, or causing his father to hear sounds that weren't there during moments when Victor was already on edge about adapting to suburban life. The reactions these interventions provoked confirmed Henry's understanding that most people lived in a state of barely controlled fear, constantly vigilant for threats that they could neither identify nor effectively combat. The psychological torture that Henry began to inflict upon his family members served multiple purposes beyond simple entertainment or the satisfaction of exercising power over others. Each successful manipulation provided valuable data about human vulnerability and the mechanisms through which fear could be weaponized against those who lacked the strength or clarity to resist such influence. More importantly, these experiments confirmed his growing conviction that he possessed capabilities that elevated him above the ordinary limitations that constrained normal human existence. His sister Alice bore the brunt of much of this early experimentation, though the specific nature of her torment remains shrouded in the kind of protective amnesia that the human mind employs when confronted with trauma too severe to process consciously. What can be inferred from her behavior during this period suggests that Henry subjected her to visions and experiences that challenged her fundamental assumptions about safety and reality, using her natural trust and innocence as vulnerabilities to be exploited rather than qualities to be protected. The justification that Henry developed for these increasingly cruel experiments drew upon his observations of natural predator behavior and his growing philosophical framework regarding the necessity of eliminating weakness wherever it manifested. In his evolving worldview, his family members had revealed themselves to be inferior specimens whose continued existence served no purpose beyond demonstrating the kind of sentimental thinking that prevented healthy ecosystems from maintaining proper balance. His father's hypocrisy in attempting to live the American dream while carrying the guilt of civilian casualties from his military service made Victor a particularly satisfying target for psychological manipulation. Henry's ability to force his father to relive the most traumatic moments of his war experience, particularly the incident in France where Victor's orders had resulted in the death of an innocent family, including a baby who burned to death in its cradle, represented both personal revenge and cosmic justice from Henry's perspective. The power to peer into Victor's memories and extract the specific images and emotions that caused the most psychological damage gave Henry unprecedented insight into the workings of guilt and trauma, knowledge that he would later apply on a much larger scale when his abilities had fully matured. The sight of his father reduced to a trembling, incoherent wreck by visions that Henry controlled completely provided confirmation that even adult authority figures were nothing more than fragile constructs that could be dismantled by someone with sufficient understanding of their psychological architecture. His mother's growing awareness that Henry was the source of their family's supernatural persecution created a different dynamic, one that involved the terrible knowledge that the child she had carried and nurtured had become something that threatened not just her own sanity but the safety of everyone around him. Virginia's desperate search for professional help, culminating in her contact with Dr. Martin Brenner, represented the last desperate attempt to find some form of intervention that might restore her son to something resembling normal human psychology. The discovery that his parents were planning to send him away for treatment triggered the final phase of Henry's psychological development, the moment when theoretical philosophy transformed into practical action. His reaction to this perceived betrayal revealed that whatever capacity for human attachment he might once have possessed had been completely consumed by his identification with the predatory efficiency of his beloved spiders, leaving behind only the cold calculation of a being that viewed other people as either useful tools or obstacles to be eliminated. The radio that Henry manipulated on the night of his family's destruction served as both amplifier for his abilities and symbolic representation of his power to control the very atmosphere in which other people existed. His methodical search through static-filled frequencies until he found the perfect accompaniment for his planned murders demonstrated the theatrical sensibility that would later characterize his adult crimes. The understanding that psychological impact could be enhanced through careful attention to environmental details. The torture device that Henry had become, by this point in his development, combined supernatural abilities with a philosophical framework that transformed cruelty into cosmic necessity, making him perhaps the most dangerous type of predator, one who believed completely in the righteousness of his actions and felt no guilt or hesitation about inflicting whatever suffering was required to achieve his goals. The Black Widow spiders that had inspired his transformation could never have imagined that their elegant efficiency would find such terrible expression in a creature that possessed both their predatory instincts and the intelligence to apply those instincts on a scale that transcended individual survival to encompass the reshaping of reality itself. The discovery that would ultimately seal the fate of the Creel family came to Henry through the same psychological infiltration abilities that he had been using to torment his loved ones for months. His telepathic surveillance, revealing a conversation between his parents that transformed their suburban home from prison into execution chamber. Virginia Creel had finally reached the breaking point that desperate mothers inevitably encounter when forced to choose between protecting their other children and saving a son who had become something that defied every assumption about childhood innocence and parental love. The clandestine meeting with Dr. Martin Brenner represented Virginia's last desperate attempt to find professional intervention for a situation that had moved far beyond the scope of conventional child psychology into territories that required expertise in phenomena that most medical professionals would refuse to acknowledge as real. Brenner's reputation within certain classified government circles as someone who specialized in unusual cases involving children with extraordinary abilities made him the only possible resource for a mother who had run out of rational options for addressing her son's supernatural malevolence. Henry's discovery of this betrayal occurred during one of his routine mental invasions of his mother's consciousness, his telepathic eavesdropping, revealing not just the practical details of their plan to send him away, but the deeper emotional reality of Virginia's complete terror regarding what her eldest child had become. The conversation he overheard through his mother's memories contained clinical terms and institutional procedures that made clear his parents' intention to transfer responsibility for his containment to authorities who possessed both the expertise and the legal authority to implement whatever measures might prove necessary to neutralize the threat he represented. The date that would forever echo through the supernatural history of Hawkins, November 6th, 1959, began like any other evening in the Creel household, with Alice absorbed in homework assignments that seemed impossibly naive given the cosmic horror that shared her living space. Victor, reviewing documents from his civilian job, while trying to suppress memories that Henry's psychological torture had made increasingly vivid and intrusive, and Virginia, preparing dinner while struggling to maintain the domestic normalcy that represented her last defense against complete psychological collapse. The radio that dominated the Creel family's living room served as both the instrument and the soundtrack for the massacre that would transform Henry from troubled child into something that transcended human categories entirely. His manipulation of the device demonstrated a level of control over electronic systems that suggested his telekinetic abilities were continuing to evolve in directions that made conventional understanding of psychic phenomena seem woefully inadequate to describe the scope of his developing powers. The methodical search through static-filled frequencies until he located the perfect auditory backdrop for his planned murders revealed the theatrical sensibility that would later characterize his adult crimes, the understanding that psychological impact could be enhanced through careful attention to environmental details that created atmosphere and amplified terror. The electronic interference that accompanied his mental manipulation of the radio circuits served notice to his family that something fundamental had shifted in their household dynamic, though none of them possessed sufficient understanding of his capabilities to recognize the warning for what it truly represented. Virginia's reaction to the radio's inexplicable behavior demonstrated the hypervigilance that had developed over months of supernatural persecution. Her immediate recognition that this technical malfunction was connected to her son's presence rather than any ordinary electrical problem. The terror in her eyes as she watched Henry's face during these moments of electromagnetic disturbance revealed a mother's intuitive understanding that she was witnessing the emergence of something that had moved beyond the boundaries of human psychology into territories that required intervention from authorities with expertise in containing threats that conventional parenting could never hope to address. Victor's investigation of the radio malfunction provided Henry with the perfect opportunity to isolate his first victim, the father whose war guilt had made him such a satisfying target for months of psychological torture, becoming the opening act in a performance of supernatural violence that would establish patterns Henry would later repeat on a much larger scale. The telekinetic force that lifted Virginia from her feet and suspended her above the dining room table represented more than simple murder. It served as a demonstration of power that transcended every assumption about the limitations that governed human existence. The systematic destruction of Virginia's body through the application of focused telekinetic pressure revealed Henry's deep understanding of anatomy and physiology. His ability to target specific organs and bone structures suggesting either instinctive knowledge or careful study of human vulnerability points that would prove most effective for inflicting maximum damage and terror. The blood that flowed from her eyes as her brain was compressed by invisible forces created a visual signature that Henry would later employ as his calling card, a grotesque artistic flourish that transformed murder into a form of twisted performance art. The sound of bones snapping under telekinetic pressure provided an auditory accompaniment to the visual horror of Virginia's death, each crack and splinter serving as punctuation marks in Henry's declaration of independence from the family structure that had failed to provide him with the understanding and acceptance he believed he deserved. The methodical nature of her destruction revealed a mind that approached violence with the same systematic curiosity he had once applied to studying his beloved black widow spiders, treating his mother's suffering as an opportunity to explore the full extent of his capabilities. The decision to deposit Virginia's corpse on the dining room table where the family had shared countless meals together demonstrated Henry's understanding of symbolism and psychological warfare, transforming a space associated with nourishment and togetherness into a monument to his rejection of everything that conventional families represented. The positioning of her broken body served as both artistic statement and practical message, communicating to the surviving family members that their most fundamental assumptions about safety and sanctuary had been permanently shattered. Victor's return to discover his wife's mutilated remains triggered exactly the kind of psychological breakdown that Henry had been cultivating through months of careful manipulation. The sight of Virginia's destroyed body, serving as the culmination of a campaign of terror that had been designed to reduce his father to a state of complete helplessness and confusion. The moment when Victor's mind attempted to process the impossible scene before him represented the intersection of supernatural reality with ordinary human psychology, a collision that inevitably resulted in the kind of cognitive fracture that would make him an unreliable witness to subsequent events. The telekinetic assault that followed Victor's discovery of his wife's body demonstrated Henry's ability to manipulate not just physical matter, but the very fabric of memory and perception, forcing his father into a hallucinatory state where past and present became indistinguishable and traumatic experiences from the war merged with current horror to create a psychological prison from which escape was impossible. The specific memories that Henry chose to weaponize against his father revealed intimate knowledge of Victor's deepest shame and most carefully guarded secrets. The incident in France that had haunted Victor since his military service involved a command decision that resulted in the bombing of a building where German soldiers were believed to be hiding, a tactical choice that seemed reasonable until Victor walked through the rubble afterward and discovered that his intelligence had been wrong and his orders had killed an entire French family instead of enemy combatants. The image that burned itself into Victor's consciousness during that long-ago afternoon was of an infant burning to death in its cradle, the sight of innocent life consumed by flames that his decisions had ignited, becoming a defining trauma that shaped every subsequent day of his existence. Henry's ability to access this specific memory and force his father to relive it with perfect clarity demonstrated a level of psychological penetration that went far beyond simple mind reading to encompass complete control over another person's subjective experience of reality. The forced re-experiencing of the burning baby served multiple purposes in Henry's campaign of family destruction. It incapacitated Victor at the crucial moment when his intervention might have saved Alice. It provided Henry with sadistic pleasure at seeing his father reduced to a helpless wreck, and it served as cosmic justice from Henry's perspective, forcing a hypocrite to confront the consequences of his actions. The paralysis that overcame Victor during this hallucinatory episode left Alice completely vulnerable to her brother's supernatural malevolence, though her fate had been sealed from the moment Henry decided that his family's continued existence was incompatible with his own psychological well-being and philosophical development. Her innocence and trust, qualities that might have protected her in any normal family crisis, became vulnerabilities that Henry exploited with the same methodical efficiency he had once applied to studying predatory behavior in his beloved spiders. Alice's death followed the same pattern that Henry had established with his mother's murder, the telekinetic suspension and systematic destruction of her small body, serving as both practical elimination of a witness and symbolic rejection of everything that childhood innocence represented in his increasingly dark worldview. Her terror and confusion during the final moments of her life provided Henry with the kind of psychological sustenance that had become necessary for his continued development, each expression of pain and bewilderment feeding something in his psyche that had grown beyond the capacity for normal human emotional nourishment. The energy that Henry absorbed from each kill represented more than simple satisfaction at successful violence. It constituted a form of supernatural nutrition that enhanced his abilities, while simultaneously corrupting whatever remnants of humanity might have survived his transformation into something that transcended ordinary categories of good and evil. The sensation he described as becoming stronger with each victim's death suggested that his murders served a purpose beyond mere elimination of obstacles, functioning instead as a form of cosmic metabolism that allowed him to incorporate aspects of his victim's life force into his own expanding consciousness. The physical and psychological exhaustion that overcame Henry following Alice's murder revealed the limitations that still constrained his developing abilities, the biological reality that even supernatural powers operated within certain parameters that could be exceeded only at great personal cost. His collapse into unconsciousness represented not weakness, but the natural consequence of pushing his capabilities beyond their current boundaries, a temporary setback that would ultimately contribute to his capture and containment by authorities who possessed at least rudimentary understanding of how to handle individuals with extraordinary abilities. The timing of Henry's collapse proved to be the crucial factor that prevented the complete success of his family massacre, releasing Victor from the hallucinatory prison that had kept him incapacitated during Alice's murder and allowing him to regain enough awareness to understand that some form of supernatural attack had devastated his household. The sight that greeted Victor when Henry's mental control finally weakened included not just the bodies of his wife and daughter, but the unconscious form of his son, creating a tableau of destruction that defied every assumption about domestic violence and family pathology. Victor's decision to flee the house with his surviving children reflected the kind of parental instinct that operates independently of rational thought, the desperate need to protect whoever might still be saved, overriding any attempt to understand or investigate the supernatural forces that had destroyed his family. His inability to comprehend that Henry was the source of their persecution, rather than another victim of whatever malevolent entity had invaded their home, would ultimately contribute to the tragic miscarriage of justice that followed, though no amount of accurate understanding could have prevented the legal and social consequences of the night's events. The authorities who responded to Victor's frantic reports encountered a crime scene that challenged every protocol and procedure for investigating domestic violence. The physical evidence suggesting forms of assault that exceeded human capabilities, while the only surviving adult witness provided testimony that sounded like the ravings of someone experiencing a complete psychological breakdown. The supernatural nature of the murders made conventional forensic analysis useless, while simultaneously ensuring that any explanation Victor might offer would be dismissed as the desperate fabrication of someone trying to avoid responsibility for obviously impossible claims. The arrest and subsequent trial of Victor Creel represented the intersection of supernatural reality with a legal system designed to address ordinary human criminality, a collision between incompatible worldviews that inevitably resulted in the punishment of an innocent man and the protection of a genuine monster. Victor's decision to plead not guilty by reason of insanity reflected not calculated legal strategy, but authentic confusion about his own mental state. The reasonable assumption that anyone who claimed to have witnessed telekinetic murder must necessarily be suffering from severe psychological disturbance. The institutional commitment that followed Victor's trial served Henry's purposes perfectly, removing the one family member who might eventually have recovered sufficiently from his trauma to provide accurate testimony about the supernatural forces that had destroyed the Creel household. Penhurst Asylum became Victor's permanent prison, a place where his truthful accounts of impossible events would be interpreted as symptoms of persistent delusion, rather than valuable intelligence about ongoing supernatural threats to public safety. Henry's unconscious body became evidence in a case that no one involved truly understood: the comatose child who represented the sole surviving member of the Creel family massacre, becoming the responsibility of medical professionals who lacked any framework for understanding either his condition or the dangers his eventual awakening would pose to everyone around him. The transfer of custody from local authorities to federal researchers represented the beginning of Henry's transformation from family destroyer into institutional subject, though the true scope of what Dr. Martin Brenner would make of this opportunity remained hidden beneath layers of classified research protocols and national security justifications. The legacy of November 6, 1959, extended far beyond the immediate tragedy of the Creel family massacre to encompass the establishment of patterns and precedents that would shape supernatural crises for decades to come. The date itself would echo through time as a recurring element in the cosmic horror that Henry would eventually unleash upon Hawkins. The anniversary of his first great victory over the forces of conventional morality and social order, becoming a temporal anchor point that would prove significant in ways that no one present during the original events could possibly have anticipated. The unconscious form of Henry Creel that Dr. Martin Brenner encountered in the aftermath of the family massacre represented not merely another test subject for his expanding collection of human experiments, but the discovery of a phenomenon that would reshape his understanding of what human consciousness could become when freed from the conventional limitations that constrained ordinary psychological development. The boy who lay motionless in the sterile hospital bed carried within his neural architecture capabilities that exceeded everything Brenner had previously encountered in his classified research into the weaponization of psychic abilities for national defense purposes. Dr. Brenner's acquisition of Henry occurred during the height of Cold War paranoia, when American intelligence agencies were desperately seeking any advantage that might provide decisive superiority over Soviet research programs that were rumored to be exploring similar territory in their quest for supernatural weapons capable of turning the tide of global conflict. The MK-Ultra program that officially began in 1953 represented only the visible portion of government efforts to understand and harness human potential that extended far beyond the boundaries of conventional science. Though most of these experiments had produced disappointing results that fell far short of the dramatic breakthroughs that military planners had hoped to achieve. The transfer of custody from local law enforcement to federal researchers occurred through channels that bypassed normal legal procedures. Henry's comatose state providing convenient cover for bureaucratic maneuvers that removed him from public scrutiny while placing him under the direct control of personnel who possessed both the security clearances and the moral flexibility necessary to conduct research that could never be subjected to civilian oversight or academic peer review. The paperwork that facilitated this transition transformed a child victim into a classified asset, erasing his legal identity while establishing his new status as Subject 001 in what would become the most ambitious attempt to mass-produce psychic soldiers in American history. The underground facility that became Henry's new home represented the intersection of cutting-edge technology with institutional architecture designed to contain and study phenomena that defied conventional understanding of human coding capabilities. Hawkins National Laboratory had been constructed according to specifications that reflected hard-won knowledge about the requirements for housing individuals whose abilities could potentially compromise any containment system that failed to account for the full scope of their extraordinary nature, though Henry's eventual awakening would reveal that even the most sophisticated precautions were inadequate when confronted with powers that operated according to principles that transcended normal physical laws. The 24 years that Henry would ultimately spend as Brenner's prisoner represented a period of relative safety for the town of Hawkins, though this protection came at the cost of allowing a genocidal entity to survive and develop under conditions that would ultimately enhance rather than diminish his capacity for inflicting suffering on a cosmic scale. The irony of Brenner's success in containing Henry was that every day of successful imprisonment brought the eventual catastrophe that much closer, each month of apparent security representing another step toward the moment when accumulated resentment and enhanced abilities would combine to create destruction that dwarfed the original Creel family massacre. Dr. Brenner's initial examination of his unconscious subject revealed biological anomalies that suggested Henry's abilities were not purely psychological phenomena, but represented fundamental alterations to his neural architecture that might potentially be understood, replicated, and eventually mass-produced through controlled scientific intervention. The electromagnetic readings that Henry's brain generated even while comatose exceeded anything in the existing literature on human consciousness, suggesting that his cognitive processes operated on frequencies that normal human awareness could never access or comprehend. The decision to designate Henry as Subject 001 reflected both his chronological priority as the first confirmed case of spontaneous psychic development and Brenner's intuitive understanding that this particular individual represented something qualitatively different from the enhanced but fundamentally human subjects that subsequent experiments would produce. The tattoo that marked Henry's wrist served multiple practical purposes: identification, inventory control, and psychological conditioning, while also symbolizing his transformation from autonomous human being into institutional property that existed solely to serve research objectives that transcended any consideration of individual rights or welfare. The extensive battery of tests that Brenner conducted during Henry's early years of captivity provided unprecedented insight into the mechanisms underlying telekinetic phenomena, though the ethical implications of subjecting an unconscious child to invasive neurological procedures were never seriously considered by researchers who had been trained to view human subjects as expendable resources in service of national security objectives that justified any means necessary to achieve strategic advantage over ideological enemies. These experiments revealed that Henry's abilities appeared to be connected to specific emotional states, particularly combinations of sadness and anger that activated neural pathways not found in conventional human brain anatomy. The controlled environment of the laboratory allowed Brenner to observe Henry's gradual awakening from his post-massacre coma under conditions that provided maximum scientific value, while ensuring that any displays of supernatural violence could be contained and studied rather than allowed to spread into the general population. The moment when Henry's eyes first opened after months of unconsciousness marked the beginning of a new phase in Brenner's research program, the transition from passive observation of biological phenomena to active engagement with a conscious entity whose cooperation would prove essential for achieving the breakthroughs that military oversight committees demanded in exchange for continued funding. Henry's initial disorientation upon awakening provided Brenner with opportunities to establish psychological control mechanisms that would prove crucial for maintaining institutional authority over someone whose abilities could theoretically allow him to escape or eliminate his captors at any moment. The carefully constructed narrative that Brenner presented to his confused subject emphasized protection and care, rather than imprisonment and exploitation, positioning the laboratory as a sanctuary where Henry's unique gifts could be studied and developed safely, rather than a prison designed to contain and weaponize his extraordinary nature for purposes that he would never be permitted to fully understand. The paternal persona that Brenner adopted in his interactions with Henry represented a calculated psychological strategy designed to exploit the natural human need for authority figures and emotional connection, transforming the Doctor from captor into protector in the mind of someone whose previous experiences with family relationships had ended in violence and abandonment. The insistence that Henry address him as Papa served multiple purposes. It established clear hierarchical relationships. It satisfied Henry's unconscious desire for the parental approval he had never received from his actual father, and it created emotional dependencies that would make rebellion psychologically difficult even when opportunities for escape presented themselves. The revelation of Henry's abilities to the laboratory staff required careful management to prevent the kind of panic and moral objection that might compromise research objectives or lead to premature termination of experiments that were just beginning to yield valuable data. Brenner's presentation of Henry's capabilities emphasized their potential military applications, while downplaying the ethical implications of holding a child prisoner for the sole purpose of weaponizing his extraordinary gifts, framing the research program as a patriotic duty that served national defense interests, rather than an unconscionable violation of human rights that would be condemned by any civilized legal system. The systematic study of Henry's psychological triggers revealed that his most dramatic displays of power occurred when he focused on memories that combined emotional pain with feelings of injustice and betrayal, suggesting that his abilities were not simply biological phenomena, but represented some form of quantum entanglement between consciousness and physical reality that operated according to principles that conventional science was only beginning to glimpse. This discovery led to the development of training protocols designed to help Henry access these emotional states reliably while maintaining sufficient psychological stability to serve as a functional research subject rather than a destructive force that would compromise the entire program. The decision to maintain Henry as the primary subject of study, while simultaneously attempting to replicate his abilities in artificially enhanced individuals, reflected Brenner's understanding that natural psychic development represented phenomena that could not be fully duplicated through technological intervention alone. The comparison between Henry's instinctive mastery of telekinetic forces and the limited capabilities demonstrated by laboratory-created subjects confirmed that spontaneous ability emergence involved factors that exceeded current scientific understanding, making Henry's cooperation essential for achieving the kind of breakthrough results that would justify the massive resources being devoted to the research program. The isolation protocols that governed Henry's daily existence were designed to prevent the formation of emotional attachments that might compromise his usefulness as an experimental subject, while simultaneously ensuring that his psychological development remained stunted at levels that would make him manageable despite his extraordinary capabilities. The sterile environment of his living quarters reflected institutional priorities that valued scientific control over human comfort, creating conditions that would gradually erode whatever remnants of normal emotional functioning might have survived his traumatic childhood experiences. The educational program that Brenner implemented for Henry served multiple purposes beyond simple intellectual development. It provided opportunities for ongoing psychological assessment. It created structured activities that could be used to reward cooperation or punish resistance, and it allowed researchers to observe how enhanced cognitive abilities interacted with conventional learning processes. The curriculum that Henry received differed significantly from normal childhood education, emphasizing subjects that would enhance his utility as a weapon, while carefully avoiding topics that might encourage independent moral reasoning or critical evaluation of his circumstances. The gradual expansion of Henry's privileges within the laboratory complex represented a carefully calibrated system of behavioral modification designed to reward compliance while maintaining absolute control over every aspect of his existence. The opportunity to move freely within certain designated areas served as powerful motivation for continued cooperation, while creating the illusion of autonomy that made psychological imprisonment more bearable than physical restraints would have been. These limited freedoms also provided Henry with opportunities to observe other aspects of the research program, knowledge that would eventually prove crucial when he began formulating plans for escape and revenge. The introduction of other enhanced children into the laboratory environment transformed Henry's role from sole research subject into senior member of an expanding community of young people whose extraordinary abilities were being developed for purposes that none of them fully understood. The arrival of these artificially created psychic individuals provided Henry with his first companion since the destruction of his family, though the relationships that developed were complicated by institutional hierarchies and the constant surveillance that made genuine emotional connection virtually impossible to achieve or maintain. The contrast between Henry's natural abilities and the limited capabilities of the laboratory-created subjects became increasingly apparent as Brenner's research program expanded to include larger numbers of enhanced children, where Henry could access his powers through emotional resonance and instinctive understanding. The artificial subjects required extensive training and technological assistance to achieve even basic telekinetic effects, suggesting that true psychic development involved factors that could not be replicated through chemical enhancement or surgical intervention alone. The psychological dynamics that emerged within the expanding community of enhanced children reflected broader patterns of institutional control and social hierarchy that Brenner carefully cultivated to maintain order among individuals whose combined abilities could theoretically overwhelm any containment system that relied purely on physical barriers or technological safeguards. Henry's position as the most powerful member of this artificial family structure provided him with authority over younger subjects, while simultaneously making him more valuable to researchers who needed his cooperation to maintain stability among the growing population of enhanced individuals. The discovery that emotional trauma could be used to enhance psychic abilities led to the development of increasingly sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques designed to maintain the enhanced children in states of controlled distress that maximize their utility as weapons while preventing the formation of emotional bonds that might encourage collective resistance against institutional authority. These methods represented refinements of techniques that had been developed during Henry's early captivity, though their application to younger and more vulnerable subjects raised ethical questions that Brenner and his staff were trained to dismiss as irrelevant considerations that might compromise national security objectives. The long-term consequences of maintaining multiple psychic individuals in close proximity began to manifest as Henry approached adulthood. His growing awareness of his unique status within the laboratory hierarchy, combining with accumulated resentment over years of imprisonment, to create psychological conditions that would eventually prove impossible for even Brenner's sophisticated control systems to contain indefinitely. The institutional environment that had successfully managed a traumatized child became increasingly inadequate for controlling a mature individual whose abilities continued to grow while his tolerance for captivity steadily diminished. The theoretical frameworks that guided Brenner's research assumed that enhanced individuals could be maintained in states of controlled dependency through carefully managed combinations of reward and punishment, but these assumptions failed to account for the psychological development that would inevitably occur as subjects matured and began to understand the true nature of their circumstances. Henry's evolution from confused victim to strategic thinker represented a threat that existing containment protocols were not designed to address. setting the stage for confrontations that would ultimately expose the fundamental flaws in any system that attempted to weaponize human beings, whose abilities exceeded the capacity of their controllers to fully comprehend or predict. The moment when Henry Creel finally attempted to assert dominance over his captor represented the inevitable collision between extraordinary ability and institutional control that Dr. Martin Brenner had been preparing for since the day he first encountered the unconscious boy in the aftermath of the family massacre. Years of careful psychological manipulation and behavioral conditioning had created an illusion of compliance that masked Henry's growing understanding of his true power and his deepening resentment toward those who had transformed him from autonomous individual into laboratory specimen for the advancement of classified research objectives that he would never be permitted to fully comprehend or meaningfully influence. The specific circumstances that triggered Henry's rebellion against Brenner's authority remain classified within the deepest layers of government documentation, though what can be inferred from subsequent events suggests that his attempt to overpower the laboratory's control systems involved a display of telekinetic force that exceeded every previous demonstration of his capabilities, while simultaneously revealing the fundamental inadequacy of containment protocols that had been designed to manage enhanced individuals rather than control entities whose abilities operated according to principles that transcended conventional understanding of human limitations. Brenner's reaction to this challenge demonstrated both his genuine fear of what Henry might become if allowed to develop without restraint, and his institutional commitment to maintaining control over research subjects regardless of the personal or ethical costs that such domination might require. The decision to implement extreme measures represented not panic but calculated escalation, the activation of contingency plans that had been developed specifically for scenarios where conventional management techniques proved insufficient to maintain the kind of absolute authority that successful weapons development demanded. The device that emerged from this crisis would become known within classified circles as the Soteria, though its official designation in government documentation obscured both its true purpose and the horrific mechanisms through which it achieved its objectives. Named after the Greek goddess of safety and deliverance from harm, the device represented the intersection of advanced neurotechnology with psychiatric control techniques that pushed the boundaries of what civilized societies might consider acceptable, even under circumstances involving national security. Threats of unprecedented magnitude. The Soteria functioned as both tracking device and neural inhibitor, its sophisticated electronics monitoring Henry's location within the laboratory complex, while simultaneously interfering with the brain activity that enabled his extraordinary abilities. The technology involved represented advances in miniaturization and biomedical engineering that exceeded anything available in the civilian sector, suggesting that military research budgets had funded developments that pushed human understanding of consciousness and neural manipulation into territories that academic science would not explore for decades. The implantation procedure required surgical precision that left minimal external scarring while establishing permanent connections between the device and specific regions of Henry's brain tissue that governed emotional processing and psychic ability activation. The operation itself was conducted without anesthesia, partly for medical reasons related to the need to monitor neural activity during the insertion process, but primarily as a form of psychological conditioning designed to establish clear consequences for future attempts to challenge institutional authority through displays of supernatural force. The mechanism by which the Soteria suppressed Henry's abilities involved targeted interference with the neural pathways that connected emotional memory to telekinetic manifestation, creating artificial barriers between the psychological states that fueled his powers and the cognitive processes that translated mental energy into physical effects. The device monitored brain activity in real time, detecting the characteristic patterns that preceded psychic displays and responding with precisely calibrated electrical impulses that disrupted the formation of these dangerous mental configurations before they could achieve sufficient coherence to manifest as observable phenomena. The experience of having his most fundamental capabilities artificially constrained represented a form of psychological castration that transformed Henry from apex predator into helpless dependent, forcing him to confront the reality that even extraordinary gifts were meaningless when opposed by institutional power backed by technological superiority and unlimited research funding. The constant awareness of the device's presence within his skull served as perpetual reminder of his vulnerability and dependence, creating conditions that would have broken the spirit of most individuals, but which only deepened Henry's commitment to eventual revenge against those who had violated his autonomy so completely. The integration of tracking capabilities within the Soteria ensured that Henry's location could be monitored continuously regardless of where he moved within the laboratory complex, transforming him into a living beacon whose every step was recorded and analyzed by security personnel trained to recognize the early warning signs of escape attempts or violent outbursts. The psychological impact of this constant surveillance exceeded the practical security benefits, creating an environment of perpetual observation that made genuine privacy impossible while reinforcing the institutional message that individual autonomy was a privilege that could be revoked rather than a fundamental right that deserved protection. The pain response that the Soteria generated when Henry attempted to access his suppressed abilities served multiple purposes beyond simple behavior modification, functioning as both punishment for unauthorized activity and research tool for understanding the precise mechanisms through which psychic phenomena interfaced with conventional neurology. The calibrated electrical shocks that accompanied any effort to bypass the device's inhibitory effects provided researchers with valuable data about the relationship between consciousness and supernatural ability, while simultaneously conditioning Henry to avoid the mental states that had once defined his identity and sense of personal power. The period of adjustment that followed the Soteria's implantation represented perhaps the most psychologically devastating phase of Henry's captivity, as he was forced to navigate daily existence without access to the extraordinary capabilities that had defined his sense of self since childhood. The simple activities that other people took for granted became monumental challenges for someone whose relationship with the physical world had been mediated by telekinetic ability for years, creating a form of sensory deprivation that extended beyond the loss of psychic power to encompass fundamental aspects of personal identity and environmental interaction. Dr. Brenner's decision to maintain Henry within the laboratory environment following the Soteria implantation reflected both practical security considerations and ongoing research objectives that required continued observation of his psychological adaptation to artificial limitation. The alternative of transferring him to a conventional psychiatric facility was rejected due to concerns about maintaining the classification security that surrounded all aspects of the psychic weapons development program, while permanent elimination was ruled out because of Henry's continued value as a research subject whose unique experiences provided insights that could not be obtained through study of artificially enhanced individuals. The role of orderly that Brenner eventually assigned to Henry represented a calculated attempt to channel his need for purposeful activity, while simultaneously maintaining institutional control over his daily routine and social interactions. This position provided him with limited authority over the laboratory's newer subjects while ensuring that his activities remained under constant supervision by security personnel trained to recognize and respond to any signs of times, rebellion or escape planning that might emerge despite the Soteria's inhibitory effects. The psychological dynamics of Henry's new position created complex tensions between his role as authority figure for the enhanced children and his status as controlled subject within the broader institutional hierarchy that governed laboratory operations. His interactions with younger subjects were carefully monitored to prevent the formation of emotional bonds that might compromise individual compliance with research protocols, while simultaneously utilizing his unique insights into psychic development to enhance the training programs that prepared enhanced children for eventual deployment as weapons. The deception that Brenner maintained regarding Henry's true identity represented one of the most sophisticated psychological manipulation campaigns ever attempted within classified government research programs, requiring the coordination of multiple personnel across different security levels to maintain consistent false narratives about the laboratory's history and population. The story that one had never existed required careful editing of institutional records and the conditioning of all personnel to reinforce lies that served strategic objectives while protecting classified information about the Crumbs, Devon, program's most dangerous subject. The irony of Henry's situation became increasingly apparent as years passed, and new subjects arrived at the laboratory with abilities that paled in comparison to what he had once possessed. Their dependence on technological assistance and extensive training, highlighting the natural superiority that the Soteria had artificially suppressed. His observations of their struggles to achieve even basic telekinetic effects served as constant reminders of what he had lost, while simultaneously fueling the resentment that would eventually drive him toward desperate measures designed to reclaim his stolen capabilities. The exploration of the laboratory's physical infrastructure that Henry conducted during his years as an orderly provided him with detailed knowledge of security systems, personnel patterns, and architectural features that would prove crucial when he eventually formulated plans for escape and revenge. His access to restricted areas during routine maintenance activities allowed him to map corridors and identify potential vulnerabilities that casual observation would never have revealed, creating an intelligence foundation that transformed him from prisoner into potential threat, despite the technological constraints that seemed to ensure his permanent compliance. The discovery of the tunnel system that connected the laboratory to external locations represented perhaps the most significant intelligence breakthrough of Henry's captivity, though his inability to exploit this knowledge, while the Soteria remained active, created additional psychological torture, as he was forced to contemplate freedom that remained tantalizingly beyond his reach. The existence of these passages suggested that the laboratory's designers had anticipated scenarios requiring covert evacuation or supply distribution, knowledge that Henry filed away for future use when circumstances might allow him to capitalize on these architectural secrets. The psychological evolution that Henry underwent during his years of artificial limitation involved the gradual transformation of rage into patience, the channeling of destructive impulses into strategic planning that would ultimately prove far more dangerous than the spontaneous violence that had characterized his earlier development. The forced delay imposed by the Soteria's constraints allowed him to develop levels of cunning and deception that his natural abilities had never required, creating a combination of supernatural power and calculated malevolence that would prove devastating when circumstances finally aligned to permit his liberation. The identification of 11 as a potential ally in his escape plans represented the culmination of years of observation and psychological assessment. Henry's recognition that her isolation and vulnerability within the laboratory hierarchy made her an ideal candidate for manipulation, despite the risks involved in attempting to corrupt someone whose cooperation was essential for the success of any rebellion against Brenner's control. Her youth and inexperience with the true nature of institutional power structures made her susceptible to influence, while her extraordinary abilities provided the key to overcoming the technological barriers that had kept Henry imprisoned for decades. The patience that Henry demonstrated during this phase of his captivity reflected hard-won understanding that premature action would result only in enhanced security measures that would make future escape attempts impossible, while successful liberation required careful timing and the coordination of multiple factors that could not be rushed without compromising the entire enterprise. The years of apparent compliance that preceded his eventual rebellion served to lower institutional vigilance while providing opportunities to study the laboratory's operations and identify the specific vulnerabilities that might be exploited when the moment for action finally arrived. The irony of Henry's situation reached its zenith during the period immediately before his escape, when his role as helpful orderly provided him with unprecedented access to the very subjects whose abilities he would eventually steal and whose lives he would sacrifice in pursuit of freedom that had been denied to him through technological intervention rather than physical imprisonment. The trust that Brenner placed in his reformed prisoner represented the greatest miscalculation in the history of classified psychic research. The assumption that artificial limitations could permanently constrain someone whose fundamental nature remained unchanged despite years of apparent compliance with institutional expectations. The recognition that slowly crystallized in Henry's mind as he observed the daily routines and social dynamics within Hawkins' laboratory eventually focused with laser precision upon a particular subject whose circumstances bore striking similarities to his own experiences of isolation and institutional rejection. Subject 011 possessed not only extraordinary telekinetic capabilities that rivaled his own suppressed abilities, but also demonstrated the kind of psychological vulnerability that made her an ideal candidate for the sophisticated manipulation techniques that Henry had been developing during his years of enforced compliance with Brenner's authority. 11's position within the laboratory hierarchy reflected the same patterns of otherness and exclusion that had characterized Henry's own childhood experiences, though her isolation stemmed from the artificial enhancement process rather than natural development of supernatural abilities. The other numbered children treated her with combinations of fear, resentment, and casual cruelty that created an environment where genuine friendship seemed impossible, while emotional connection remained a desperate need that could potentially be exploited by someone who understood the psychological mechanisms underlying her vulnerability. The systematic bullying that 11 endured from subjects who possessed lesser abilities but greater social confidence within the institutional environment provided Henry with perfect opportunities to position himself as her protector and advocate, someone who understood her suffering because he had experienced similar rejection, and who could offer the kind of guidance and support that the laboratory's official structure seemed incapable of providing. Her responses to these attacks revealed both the depth of her need for acceptance and the extent of her ignorance regarding the true nature of the institution that claimed to serve as her family. Henry's initial approach to cultivating 11's trust involved subtle interventions during moments when her distress was most acute, offering comfort and understanding that seemed to emerge spontaneously from genuine empathy rather than calculated manipulation. These carefully staged encounters occurred in locations where surveillance cameras could not record their interactions, creating the illusion of secret friendship while allowing Henry to begin the gradual process of psychological conditioning that would eventually transform her from potential obstacle into unwitting accomplice. The chess games that became their regular meeting ritual served multiple strategic purposes beyond providing cover for conversations that could not occur within range of institutional monitoring systems. The intellectual challenge of the game itself created positive associations with their time together, while demonstrating Henry's superior analytical abilities in ways that reinforced his position as mentor and guide. More importantly, the metaphorical aspects of chess provided perfect opportunities for him to introduce concepts about strategy, sacrifice, and the necessity of eliminating opponents who threatened one's survival and advancement. The revelation of institutional deception that Henry carefully orchestrated represented the first major breakthrough in his campaign to undermine Eleven's trust in the authority figures who controlled her existence. His disclosure that Dr. Brenner had lied about the existence of Subject 001 provided concrete evidence of official dishonesty, while simultaneously establishing Henry's credibility as someone who possessed knowledge that the laboratory's leadership preferred to keep hidden from their subjects. The psychological impact of discovering that fundamental aspects of her understood reality were based on deliberate falsehoods created exactly the kind of cognitive dissonance that Henry needed to exploit if he hoped to turn Eleven's loyalty away from institutional authority toward personal allegiance to him. The careful timing of this revelation ensured that it occurred during a period when she was already questioning her place within the laboratory hierarchy, making her more receptive to alternative explanations for her circumstances than she might have been under different emotional conditions. The training advice that Henry provided under the guise of helpful mentorship represented perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of his manipulation campaign, offering genuine improvements to Eleven's telekinetic performance while simultaneously undermining the psychological control mechanisms that Dr. Brenner used to maintain authority over enhanced subjects. The specific technique he shared, accessing memories that combined sadness with anger, rather than maintaining the emotional detachment that official protocols demanded, directly contradicted institutional training while providing dramatic enhancements to her capabilities. The memory of Eleven's mother that Henry encouraged her to focus upon served multiple purposes within his broader strategic framework, providing her with the emotional fuel necessary for enhanced telekinetic performance, while also reinforcing narratives about institutional betrayal and the separation of children from their natural families for purposes that served research objectives rather than individual welfare. This particular recollection carried special significance because it involved Dr. Brenner's direct responsibility for destroying the maternal bond that represented Eleven's most important emotional connection to the world outside the laboratory. The dramatic improvement in Eleven's abilities that resulted from following Henry's guidance created immediate practical benefits that validated his credibility as a mentor, while simultaneously exposing her to the kind of institutional punishment that would reinforce his warnings about the true nature of those who claimed to care for her well-being. The enhanced performance that she demonstrated during training sessions violated explicit protocols designed to maintain subjects at manageable power levels, ensuring that Brenner would respond with corrective measures that would appear to confirm Henry's predictions about official reactions to unauthorized development. Dr. Brenner's recognition that someone was interfering with his carefully controlled training program represented the inevitable intersection of Henry's manipulation campaign with institutional security protocols designed to identify and eliminate unauthorized influences within the subject population. The electromagnetic signatures and behavioral patterns that accompanied Eleven's enhanced performance provided clear evidence of outside intervention, though the sophisticated nature of Henry's deception made identifying the specific source of this corruption more challenging than Brenner initially anticipated. The punishment that Brenner ordered for Henry's interference took the form of electrical torture administered by laboratory security personnel, a response calculated to demonstrate the consequences of unauthorized contact with subjects while simultaneously providing Henry with opportunities to reinforce his position as Eleven's protector and victim of institutional brutality. The public nature of this disciplinary action ensured that other subjects would witness the violence, while Eleven specifically would understand that Henry's suffering resulted directly from his attempts to help her develop capabilities that threatened official control systems. The psychological impact of witnessing Henry's torture exceeded even his most optimistic predictions regarding its effect on Eleven's emotional development and institutional loyalty. Her horror at seeing someone who had shown her kindness subjected to extreme violence for the crime of providing assistance created exactly the kind of traumatic bonding experience that would make her more susceptible to his influence, while simultaneously generating the anger and resentment that his escape plan would eventually require her to channel into destructive action against their mutual captors. The theatrical aspects of Henry's punishment served strategic purposes that extended beyond its immediate effects on Eleven's psychology, demonstrating to the broader subject population that institutional authority was maintained through violence rather than legitimate concern for their welfare, while creating martyrdom to narratives that positioned him as courageous victim rather than dangerous manipulator. The careful calibration of his responses during the torture ensured that he appeared noble and self-sacrificing rather than calculating, maintaining the deception that his actions were motivated by genuine care for Eleven rather than personal objectives that required her cooperation. The period of isolation that followed Henry's punishment provided him with opportunities to refine his manipulation strategy, while allowing the emotional impact of his suffering to intensify within Eleven's consciousness, creating conditions where her guilt about his victimization would make her more willing to accept risks on his behalf. When the moment for decisive action finally arrived, the apparent randomness of the attack that subsequently targeted Eleven served Henry's purposes perfectly, though whether he directly orchestrated the incident or simply recognized an opportunity to exploit existing tensions within the subject population remains unclear from available evidence. The assault that Eleven suffered at the hands of other numbered children occurred under circumstances that suggested coordination and planning rather than spontaneous aggression, though the deactivation of surveillance cameras during the incident made determining the true source of this attack impossible through conventional investigation methods. The specific nature of the violence, designed to cause significant injury without permanent damage, reflected understanding of institutional protocols and psychological manipulation techniques that exceeded what normal subject interactions would have produced without external guidance. Dr. Brenner's response to the attack demonstrated both his genuine concern for Eleven's well-being and his recognition that the laboratory's social dynamics had become destabilized in ways that threatened the entire research program if allowed to continue unchecked. The punishment he imposed upon the attackers was severe enough to discourage future incidents while simultaneously confirming Henry's warnings about the institutional violence that awaited anyone who failed to maintain their assigned position within the laboratory hierarchy. The fear that spread through the subject population following Brenner's disciplinary response created exactly the kind of environment that Henry needed for the final phase of his manipulation campaign. As Eleven's awareness that she remained a target for future violence made her desperate for protection that only he seemed able or willing to provide. The chess game during which he revealed the fabricated conspiracy theory about Brenner's intentions represented the culmination of months of psychological conditioning, the moment when accumulated trust and manufactured evidence combined to overcome her remaining skepticism about his motives. The specific conspiracy that Henry constructed involved claims that Dr. Brenner was deliberately orchestrating attacks against 11 as part of a larger plan to eliminate her through violence that could be attributed to subject conflicts rather than institutional policy. This narrative explained both the timing of recent events and the apparent coordination among her attackers, while positioning Henry as the only person within the laboratory who possessed both the knowledge and the courage to warn her about the approaching danger. The emotional manipulation that accompanied this revelation involved Henry's careful presentation of himself as reluctant messenger who would prefer to remain silent rather than burden her with terrifying knowledge, creating the impression that his disclosure was motivated by genuine concern for her safety rather than calculated attempt to gain her cooperation for purposes she could not be permitted to understand. The fabricated urgency of the threat he described made immediate action seem necessary, while the complexity of his proposed solution required her complete trust and compliance with instructions that she would not be able to evaluate independently. The meeting in the boiler room that Henry arranged as the setting for his final manipulation represented both practical necessity and symbolic significance. The underground location providing privacy from surveillance systems, while the industrial environment reinforced themes about hidden dangers and institutional deception that had characterized his entire manipulation campaign. The revelation of the Soteria device and his claims about its function served multiple strategic purposes, generating sympathy for his suffering while establishing the technological barrier that prevented him from protecting her through his own abilities. The device that Henry showed to 11 appeared to be nothing more than a simple tracking mechanism, its true function as neural inhibitor disguised through carefully constructed explanations that emphasized surveillance capabilities rather than the more sophisticated control systems that actually governed its operation. This deception allowed him to present himself as fellow prisoner rather than dangerous entity whose containment was essential for public safety, creating the emotional connection necessary for convincing her to remove the device despite the obvious risks involved in such action. The moment when 11 used her telekinetic abilities to extract the Soteria from Henry's neck represented the culmination of one of the most sophisticated psychological manipulation campaigns in the history of classified government research. The successful conversion of institutional security asset into unwitting accomplice in what would become the most devastating breach of containment protocols ever recorded. The immediate sensation of restored capability that flooded through Henry's consciousness as the device's inhibitory effects ceased provided confirmation that his years of patient planning and careful deception had finally achieved the objective that had sustained him through decades of artificial limitation. The guards who interrupted their escape attempt arrived according to timing that suggested Henry had anticipated their intervention, rather than being surprised by the discovery of his activities, though his apparent shock and desperate improvisation masked the calculated nature of his response to what may have been a deliberately orchestrated confrontation. The violence he unleashed against these security personnel represented not loss of control but careful demonstration of capabilities that had been suppressed for so long that even he had begun to question whether they could be fully recovered. The revelation of his true identity through the display of his 001 tattoo served as the final element in his manipulation campaign, the disclosure that transformed him from mysterious ally into the legendary first subject whose existence had been denied by institutional authority. This moment of truth created the psychological conditions necessary for the massacre that would follow. Eleven's shock and confusion providing him with the emotional cover needed to complete his revenge against those who had imprisoned and controlled him for so many years. The closet where Henry instructed 11 to hide during his rampage served both practical and symbolic purposes, protecting her from witnessing the full extent of his violence while positioning her as innocent bystander rather than accomplice in the destruction that would reshape the laboratory's population and ultimately open doorways to dimensions that humanity was not prepared to encounter or comprehend. The removal of the Soteria device from Henry's neck unleashed forces that had been artificially contained for decades. The sudden restoration of his full telekinetic capabilities, combining with years of accumulated rage to create a phenomenon that exceeded even his own expectations regarding the scope of destruction that his liberated powers could achieve. The sensation of restored ability flooded through his consciousness like electricity through copper wire, every neuron reconnecting to pathways that had been severed by technological intervention, while his awareness expanded to encompass the entire laboratory complex with a clarity and precision that made his childhood abilities seem crude and underdeveloped by comparison. The first guards to encounter Henry following his liberation from artificial constraints experienced the full force of supernatural violence that had been suppressed since his initial rebellion against Brenner's authority, their deaths serving both as immediate revenge against those who had participated in his torture and as practical demonstration to 11 that the helpless orderly she thought she knew had been transformed back into something that transcended every conventional understanding of human capability and moral limitation. The methodical nature of their execution revealed that Henry's years of forced compliance had not diminished his capacity for calculated brutality, but had instead refined his understanding of how to inflict maximum psychological impact through displays of power that combined physical destruction with symbolic significance. The electromagnetic disturbances that accompanied Henry's renewed use of his abilities created cascading failures throughout the laboratory's electronic security systems, surveillance cameras flickering and dying while magnetic locks released in sequence throughout the complex as his psychic energy interfaced with technological infrastructure in ways that the facility's designers had never anticipated or prepared for during the original construction phase. These technical malfunctions served his purposes perfectly by eliminating evidence of his activities while creating confusion among security personnel who lacked both the training and the conceptual framework necessary for responding to threats that operated according to principles that exceeded conventional understanding of human limitations. The pattern of systematic elimination that Henry implemented as he moved through the laboratory's corridors reflected both his intimate knowledge of the facility's layout and his deep understanding of the psychological mechanisms that governed institutional hierarchy and individual behavior under extreme stress. Each kill was calculated to maximize terror among potential witnesses, while simultaneously serving his larger strategic objective of eliminating every person who possessed knowledge of his true nature and capabilities, transforming the research facility from prison into tomb with the methodical efficiency of someone who had spent years planning exactly this scenario. Dr. Brenner's reaction to reports of supernatural violence within his previously secure facility demonstrated both his genuine horror at the resurrection of his greatest failure and his professional recognition that the containment protocols he had developed over decades of classified research were proving inadequate when confronted with abilities that had evolved far beyond their original parameters through years of artificial suppression and psychological conditioning. The emergency procedures that he activated represented the most extreme contingency plans available within government protocols for handling breaches of supernatural containment, though the effectiveness of these measures had never been tested under conditions involving subjects whose capabilities exceeded every previous classification system. The children who became Henry's primary targets during his rampage represented not just convenient victims, but specific symbols of everything he had been denied during his years of imprisonment and artificial limitation. Their young faces and developing abilities served as reminders of the potential he had possessed before institutional interference transformed him from natural phenomenon into controlled weapon, while their terror and helplessness provided the kind of psychological satisfaction that years of suppressed rage demanded as compensation for decades of humiliation and constraint. The systematic nature of each execution revealed Henry's deep understanding of human anatomy and the most efficient methods for causing maximum suffering before death, knowledge that may have been acquired through observation of medical procedures during his captivity, or through instinctive comprehension of biological vulnerability that accompanied his supernatural development. The specific techniques he employed, telekinetic pressure applied to organs and bone structures in sequences that prolonged agony while ensuring inevitable mortality, created a signature pattern that would later be recognized as characteristic of his particular approach to eliminating obstacles and expressing dominance. The youngest victims, whose deaths punctuated Henry's massacre through the laboratory, demonstrated his complete abandonment of any moral constraints that might have survived his psychological transformation during captivity, their innocence and vulnerability serving not as deterrents, but as additional sources of satisfaction for someone whose worldview had crystallized around the principle that weakness deserved elimination, regardless of age or circumstance. The sounds of their terror provided auditory accompaniment to his methodical progress through the facility, while their final moments of suffering fed something in his consciousness that had been starved during years of artificial constraint and enforced compliance. The older subjects who attempted to resist or escape Henry's supernatural assault found their own enhanced abilities woefully inadequate when confronted with powers that operated on fundamentally different principles from their artificially induced capabilities. The disparity between natural psychic development and laboratory-enhanced abilities became tragically apparent as their attempts at telekinetic defense were overwhelmed by forces that exceeded their comprehension, while their training in controlled application of limited powers proved useless against an opponent whose approach to violence transcended every parameter that institutional education had taught them to expect or counter. The laboratory staff who witnessed Henry's transformation from compliant orderly into genocidal entity experienced the kind of cognitive shock that occurs when fundamental assumptions about reality are violently contradicted by phenomena that should not exist according to every framework they had been trained to use for understanding their research environment. Their attempts to implement standard emergency procedures revealed the inadequacy of conventional responses when confronted with threats that operated according to supernatural principles, while their horror at witnessing the systematic elimination of subjects they had known as individuals provided Henry with additional psychological satisfaction as he demonstrated the futility of institutional authority when challenged by genuinely superior power. The architectural features of the laboratory that Henry had studied during his years as orderly became tactical advantages during his massacre. His knowledge of corridor layouts and security choke points, allowing him to systematically trap and eliminate targets while preventing organized resistance from forming among the survivors. The very familiarity that had once made him valuable as an institutional asset now served his destructive purposes, as he used understanding gained through trusted access to maximize the efficiency of his revenge against those who had presumed to control and contain forces they could never truly comprehend. The electromagnetic phenomena that accompanied Henry's most intense displays of telekinetic violence began to affect the fundamental structure of space and time within the laboratory's deepest levels, reality itself seeming to bend and warp around concentrations of psychic energy that exceeded every theoretical limit that government scientists had postulated during their studies of enhanced human consciousness. These distortions in the fabric of local space-time created conditions that would eventually prove crucial for the interdimensional breach that would transform his personal revenge into a crisis with implications that extended far beyond the boundaries of any single research facility or classified program. The moment when Henry finally encountered 11, after completing his systematic elimination of everyone else within the laboratory, represented the culmination of years of psychological manipulation and strategic planning, though her reaction to discovering the true scope of his capabilities revealed that his assessment of her character and loyalty had contained fundamental miscalculations that would ultimately prove decisive for determining the outcome of their confrontation. The horror and revulsion that she displayed upon witnessing the aftermath of his massacre indicated that her moral development had proceeded along different trajectories than he had anticipated, creating the possibility of resistance that his strategic planning had not adequately considered. The revelation of his complete plan that Henry offered to 11 during their final confrontation demonstrated both his genuine belief in the righteousness of his actions and his profound misunderstanding of her psychological development during the years they had known each other within the institutional environment. His vision of cosmic restructuring and the elimination of human civilization's artificial constraints assumed that she would share his philosophical framework regarding the necessity of destroying existing systems in order to create better alternatives, though her responses indicated that her experiences of imprisonment and abuse had led her toward different conclusions about the nature of justice and the value of individual life. The philosophical divide that became apparent during their final conversation reflected fundamental differences in how extraordinary individuals might respond to systematic oppression and institutional abuse. Henry's trajectory toward nihilistic destruction, contrasting sharply with 11's retention of empathy and moral constraint, despite experiencing comparable trauma during her own development within the laboratory's controlled environment. These psychological differences would prove decisive during their physical confrontation, as their opposing approaches to channeling enhanced abilities created conditions that neither of them had fully anticipated or prepared for during their years of shared captivity. The cosmic scope of Henry's ambitions for reshaping reality according to principles that eliminated the weaknesses and contradictions he perceived in human civilization revealed the extent to which his isolation and artificial enhancement had disconnected him from any meaningful understanding of the values and relationships that made existence worthwhile for most people. His inability to comprehend why 11 might prefer the flawed but authentic connections she had experienced to the perfect but sterile order he envisioned created the emotional and philosophical foundation for the conflict that would prefer the emotional, ultimately determine not just their personal fates but the relationship between dimensions that had remained separate since the beginning of time. The telekinetic battle that erupted between them represented more than simple conflict between enhanced individuals. It embodied the fundamental struggle between competing visions of what humanity might become when freed from conventional limitations. Henry's embrace of predatory efficiency confronting Eleven's commitment to preserving the emotional connections that gave meaning to consciousness regardless of its enhanced capabilities. The intensity of their confrontation generated energy fields that began to affect local space-time in ways that neither government scientists nor the combatants themselves fully understood, creating conditions for phenomena that would reshape the relationship between parallel dimensions. The memory that Eleven chose to focus upon during their battle, her mother's voice expressing love and acceptance, represented more than simple emotional anchor in moments of crisis, functioning instead as conscious rejection of the anger and resentment that Henry insisted were necessary for accessing true power. This fundamental difference in approach to channeling supernatural abilities created a resonance pattern that interfered with Henry's own energy signature, while simultaneously amplifying her own capabilities in ways that transcended every theoretical framework that had been developed for understanding psychic phenomena during decades of classified research. The dimensional breach that resulted from their confrontation occurred not as intended consequence of either combatants' actions, but as uncontrolled side effect of psychic energies that exceeded the capacity of local space-time to base, contain, or channel without fundamental alterations to the structure of reality itself. The gateway that opened during the climax of their battle connected the laboratory's basement to regions of existence that had remained isolated from human awareness since the formation of the universe, creating a permanent alteration in the relationship between parallel dimensions that would have consequences extending far beyond anything either Henry or Eleven could have predicted or desired. The moment when Henry was pulled through the dimensional barrier represented both victory and tragedy. Eleven's successful defense of the values she had chosen to embrace, achieved through methods that banished her opponent to realms of existence where his already corrupted nature would be further twisted by exposure to forces that operated according to principles even more alien and hostile than those governing his own psychological development. The portal that sealed itself after consuming him left behind only silence and the scattered evidence of destruction that would require explanations extending far beyond what institutional authorities were prepared to provide to oversight, committees, or the general public. The psychological trauma that Eleven experienced following her victory over Henry reflected not just the immediate stress of their confrontation, but her growing awareness that she had potentially unleashed consequences that extended far beyond the laboratory's walls into dimensions of existence that humanity was not prepared to encounter or comprehend. The knowledge that she had been manipulated into enabling his escape from technological constraints while simultaneously being forced to banish him through her own defensive actions created a complex web of responsibility and guilt that would shape her understanding of her role in subsequent supernatural crises. The electromagnetic aftermath of their battle left permanent alterations in the laboratory's deepest levels, reality itself seeming to retain memory of the forces that had briefly transcended every natural law during their climactic confrontation. These residual distortions in local spacetime would continue to influence events within the facility long after Henry's banishment, creating conditions where the boundary between normal existence and supernatural phenomena remained permanently weakened, in ways that would eventually require ongoing vigilance from authorities who lacked adequate understanding of what they were attempting to monitor and contain. The silence that settled over Hawkins' laboratory following the massacre represented more than simple absence of life. It embodied the kind of cosmic pause that occurs when fundamental forces have been set in motion that will require years or decades to achieve their full expression. The empty corridors and abandoned research stations served as monuments to the inadequacy of institutional approaches to controlling phenomena that transcended human understanding. while the sealed dimensional breach in the basement level represented a door that had been opened and closed but never properly locked, leaving behind possibilities for future catastrophe that no amount of official denial or classification could permanently eliminate. The dimensional void into which Henry Creel was cast by Eleven's desperate defensive strike existed as a realm where the fundamental laws governing matter, energy, and consciousness operated according to principles so alien to human understanding that even describing them requires abandoning conventional concepts of space, time, and causality in favor of frameworks that acknowledge realities beyond the scope of earthbound physics. This place that would eventually be known as the Upside Down represented not simply an alternate version of familiar reality, but something far more disturbing, a universe where the basic assumptions about existence had been inverted, corrupted, and reimagined according to the needs of intelligences that predated human civilization by eons. The atmosphere through which Henry tumbled during his violent transition between dimensions carried electrical charges that operated on frequencies beyond anything that existed within normal space-time. Lightning storms that crackled with energies drawn from sources that transcended the electromagnetic spectrum to encompass forms of power that could reshape matter at the subatomic level, while simultaneously altering the consciousness of any being unfortunate enough to encounter them without adequate preparation or protection. The bolts that lashed across his human flesh as he fell through this alien environment left marks that went deeper than simple electrical burns, scarring his cellular structure in ways that would gradually transform him from recognizably human entity into something that belonged more properly to the nightmarish ecosystem that governed this inverted realm. The physical agony that accompanied Henry's transformation during his first exposure to the Upside Down's hostile environment served not merely as punishment for his crimes, but as necessary preparation for survival in a dimension where ordinary biological processes would prove inadequate for maintaining existence beyond the first few moments of unprotected exposure. The electrical storms that stripped away layers of his human appearance also rewrote the genetic instructions that governed his cellular metabolism, adapting his physiology to operate according to principles that would allow him to not just survive, but eventually thrive, in conditions that would instantly destroy any normal human consciousness. The creatures that Henry encountered during his initial exploration of this nightmarish landscape operated according to hive mind principles that represented the ultimate expression of the collective consciousness ideologies he had once rejected when they appeared in human political systems. Though the alien nature of these beings made their telepathic unity seem less like communist organization and more like the coordinated behavior of a vast biological machine designed to serve purposes that individual understanding could never fully comprehend. Their immediate hostility toward his human presence provided him with his first practical lesson in the survival requirements that would govern his existence in this dimension. The decision that crystallized in Henry's consciousness during those first desperate hours of survival represented not surrender to hostile alien forces, but recognition that conquest through adaptation offered possibilities for expressing his predatory nature on scales that earthbound limitations had never permitted. Rather than attempting to resist or escape the creatures that swarmed toward his dimensional intrusion, he chose instead to demonstrate the superior capabilities that his years of psychic development had created, turning his telekinetic abilities against beings that had never encountered resistance from newly arrived dimensional refugees. The storm clouds that became the focus of Henry's initial conquest attempts represented more than simple meteorological phenomena. They embodied the atmospheric expression of the hive mind consciousness that governed all aspects of existence within the Upside Down. their electromagnetic properties serving as communication networks that connected every living entity within the dimension through channels that operated simultaneously on multiple levels of reality. His success in gaining control over these aerial formations marked the beginning of his transformation from human prisoner to dimensional overlord, the process through which Henry reshaped the conquered storm clouds into the form that would become known as the Mind Flayer, drew upon both his childhood fascination with predatory arachnids and his growing understanding of how consciousness itself could be sculpted and directed according to principles that transcended individual identity. The spider-like configuration he imposed upon the atmospheric entity reflected not nostalgia for earthbound memories, but strategic recognition that the Black Widow's solitary hunting patterns provided perfect templates for organizing consciousness that prioritized efficiency over sentiment. The integration of his individual awareness into the broader hive mind network that governed the Upside Down occurred gradually over months and years of careful negotiation between his human psychology and the alien intelligences that had dominated this realm since time immemorial. The process required abandoning many aspects of personal identity that he had once considered fundamental to his nature, while simultaneously maintaining enough individual consciousness to serve as controlling intelligence within the live, collective system that would eventually encompass vast networks of interdimensional entities. The philosophical satisfaction that Henry derived from creating his own version of communist collective consciousness represented the ultimate irony of his dimensional exile, as the political system he had once despised when implemented by human governments became the organizational principle through which he achieved dominion over beings whose capabilities exceeded anything that earthbound political movements could ever hope to command or control. The hive mind he established operated according to principles that eliminated individual dissent, not through external coercion, but through the complete absorption of personal identity into collective purpose. The years that Henry spent adapting to his role as Supreme Commander of the Upside Down's indigenous life forms allowed him to explore possibilities for consciousness expansion that no human being had ever experienced, his awareness growing to encompass not just the immediate dimension where his physical form resided, but the broader network of parallel realities that existed adjacent to his new domain. This expanded perception revealed opportunities for influence and intervention that would eventually allow him to resume his campaign against the human civilization that had imprisoned and betrayed him. The physical transformation that accompanied Henry's psychological integration into the Upside Down's collective consciousness proceeded through stages that gradually erased his human appearance while enhancing the supernatural capabilities that had originally marked him as extraordinary, even by the standards of Brenner's enhanced subjects. The electrical scarring that had begun during his violent arrival continued to spread across his body, as his cellular structure adapted to channel and focus the alien energies that permeated every aspect of his new environment. The deterioration of recognizably human features served practical purposes beyond simple adaptation to environmental conditions, as his increasingly monstrous appearance eliminated any possibility of psychological attachment to his original identity, while simultaneously enhancing his ability to intimidate and control beings whose cooperation was essential for implementing the expanded campaign of revenge that he began, planning almost immediately upon achieving stability within his new realm. The creature he was becoming bore little resemblance to the troubled child who had once collected spiders in mason jars, though the essential predatory nature remained unchanged. The development of new sensory capabilities that allowed Henry to perceive activities and events occurring within adjacent dimensions provided him with intelligence-gathering abilities that far exceeded anything he had possessed during his earthbound existence, his awareness extending through dimensional barriers to encompass the ongoing activities of those who had once controlled his fate. This expanded perception revealed that Dr. Brenner had survived the laboratory massacre and was continuing his research programs despite the catastrophic loss of subjects and facilities. The patient observation that Henry conducted of events within the parallel dimension where humanity continued its oblivious existence revealed opportunities for subtle intervention that would allow him to resume his campaign of systematic elimination without alerting his enemies to his survival and enhanced capabilities. The knowledge that dimensional barriers could be manipulated through careful application of focused psychic energy opened possibilities for reaching across space-time to influence events according to his strategic objectives. The creatures of the Upside Down that fell under Henry's control during his rise to power within their hierarchical system possessed capabilities that complemented and enhanced his own psychic abilities, while providing him with tools for implementing violence on scales that his individual powers alone could never have achieved. The Demogorgons served as perfect instruments for hunting and elimination, their predatory instincts and dimensional mobility, making them ideal agents for operations that required reaching into parallel realities to eliminate specific targets. The biological modifications that Henry's presence introduced into the Upside Down's ecosystem reflected his growing understanding of how consciousness and matter could be combined and restructured according to principles that served strategic rather than natural purposes. The creatures that emerged from his influence possessed enhanced abilities, while maintaining complete loyalty to the collective intelligence that he had shaped according to his own philosophical frameworks and tactical requirements. The temporal aspects of existence within the Upside Down operated according to principles that allowed Henry to maintain awareness of multiple timeline streams simultaneously, his consciousness encompassing not just present circumstances, but potential futures that might result from various intervention strategies. This expanded temporal perception provided him with strategic advantages that no earthbound intelligence could hope to match, allowing him to plan operations that would unfold across years or decades while accounting for variables that linear thinking could never adequately address. The discovery that the Upside Down existed in a state of temporal suspension relative to the normal flow of time within adjacent dimensions revealed possibilities for preserving and manipulating specific moments or environments according to his psychological needs and strategic requirements. The ability to freeze time within localized regions of his domain allowed him to create memorial spaces where significant events could be preserved indefinitely for study, contemplation, or psychological manipulation of future victims. The network of biological connections that spread throughout the Upside Down under Henry's influence created communication systems that operated simultaneously on multiple levels of reality, allowing him to coordinate activities across vast distances while maintaining awareness of any threats or opportunities that might emerge within his expanding sphere of control. The vine-like structures that carried information and commands throughout his domain served as both nervous system and transportation network for a consciousness that had grown beyond the limitations of individual embodiment. The philosophical framework that Henry developed during his years of dimensional exile crystallized around the principle that existence should be organized according to principles of perfect efficiency, rather than the chaotic emotionalism that characterized human civilization. His growing power, providing him with opportunities to implement systematic corrections to what he increasingly perceived as fundamental flaws in the structure of reality itself. The dimension he controlled became a laboratory where consciousness could be refined and purified according to standards that eliminated weakness and uncertainty. The preparation for eventual return to active intervention in human affairs required careful development of capabilities and resources that would allow him to operate across dimensional boundaries while maintaining the security of his base of operations within the Upside Down. The strategies he developed during this planning phase drew upon his intimate knowledge of human psychology and institutional vulnerability, while incorporating the enhanced capabilities and alien perspectives that his dimensional exile had provided. The moment when Henry felt sufficiently prepared to resume direct contact with the reality he had been forced to abandon marked the beginning of a new phase in his campaign against human civilization. Though his methods would necessarily be far more sophisticated than the crude violence that had characterized his earlier attempts at systematic elimination, the power he had accumulated during his exile would allow him to implement plans whose scope and subtlety exceeded anything that earthbound authorities could anticipate or effectively counter through conventional defensive measures. The identity that emerged from Henry's transformation within the Upside Down retained the core characteristics that had marked his original psychology, while incorporating perspectives and capabilities that elevated his threat level far beyond what any human institution could adequately assess or prepare for during the early stages of his return to active operations. The entity that would eventually be known as Vecna represented not just enhanced version of Henry Creel, but fundamental evolution of consciousness itself, adapted for purposes that transcended individual survival to encompass the restructuring of reality, according to principles that acknowledged no authority beyond perfect efficiency and absolute control. The dimensional exile that had transformed Henry Creel into something beyond human recognition could not permanently contain his obsession with the world that had rejected and betrayed him, though his return to influence over earthbound events would require patience and subtlety that his previous incarnation had never possessed. The years spent mastering the alien consciousness networks of the Upside Down had provided him with perspectives on time and causality that operated on scales measured in decades rather than moments, allowing him to perceive opportunities for intervention that would unfold gradually through seemingly unrelated events, orchestrated according to strategic principles that no earthbound intelligence could anticipate or effectively counter. Dr. Martin Brenner's survival of the laboratory massacre represented both obstacle and opportunity for the entity that Henry had become, the continued existence of his former captor, providing access to research programs and institutional resources that could potentially be manipulated to serve purposes that their original designers would never willingly support. The reconstruction efforts that Brenner initiated following the catastrophic loss of subjects and facilities demonstrated his institutional commitment to continuing psychic weapons development, despite the obvious dangers that such research represented to personnel and public safety alike. The decision to utilize Eleven's astral projection capabilities for exploring the dimensional breach that had consumed Henry reflected Brenner's desperate need to understand and control phenomena that had already exceeded his Brenner capacity for scientific analysis or institutional management. The sensory deprivation techniques that enhanced her ability to perceive activities within parallel dimensions provided the perfect opportunity for dimensional entities to establish contact with earthbound consciousness through channels that bypassed normal defensive barriers while creating conditions for influence that could be sustained across the space-time barriers separating parallel realities. The search parameters that Brenner established for Eleven's dimensional exploration missions were carefully designed to locate Henry's consciousness within the alien landscape where he had been banished, though the official justification for these operations emphasized their potential military applications against Soviet research programs, rather than acknowledging the personal motivations that drove Brenner's obsession with recovering his most dangerous former subject. The systematic exploration of the Upside Down's geography through astral projection created detailed intelligence about dimensional topology, while simultaneously providing Henry with opportunities to study his enemies without alerting them to his continued existence and enhanced capabilities. The Demogorgon that Eleven encountered during her psychic reconnaissance of the Upside Down represented not random predatory creature, but carefully positioned agent of Henry's expanding influence. Its presence at the specific coordinates where her consciousness manifested reflecting strategic planning rather than coincidental intersection of earthbound curiosity with alien hostility. The mutual surprise that characterized their initial contact served Henry's purposes perfectly by creating conditions where dimensional boundaries could be breached through the combined psychic energies of terrestrial and alien consciousness systems operating in unintended harmony. The electromagnetic disturbance that accompanied Eleven's contact with the Demogorgon generated sufficient dimensional instability to create permanent gateways between parallel realities, though the specific locations where these portals manifested reflected Henry's understanding of Hawkins' geography and his strategic objectives for resuming operations within the community that had served as the backdrop for both his childhood development and his ultimate transformation into something that transcended human categories entirely. The portal that opened within the laboratory's basement level provided direct access to the facility where Brenner continued his research programs, while the secondary gateway in the forested area, known as Mirkwood, created opportunities for covert operations that could be conducted without immediate detection by institutional security systems. The liberation of the Demogorgon into the normal dimensional framework of Hawkins marked the beginning of a new phase in Henry's campaign against human civilization, though his control over the creature's activities remained indirect due to the vast distances separating his consciousness from the earthbound environment where his agent would operate. The predatory instincts that drove the Demogorgon's behavior aligned sufficiently with Henry's strategic objectives to ensure that its hunting activities would create the kind of terror and disruption that served his broader purposes, while simultaneously providing him with intelligence about the current state of the community that had shaped his original development. The selection of William Byers and Barbara Holland as the Demogorgon's primary targets reflected Henry's growing understanding of how individual disappearances could generate maximum psychological impact within small communities, while simultaneously providing him with test subjects for evaluating the effectiveness of biological control mechanisms that would prove crucial for implementing larger-scale operations in future phases of his campaign. The specific circumstances surrounding each abduction demonstrated the creature's ability to operate according to strategic principles rather than simple predatory instincts, suggesting that Henry's influence could extend across dimensional boundaries to direct tactical operations despite his physical separation from the theater of activities. The biological implantation process that the Demogorgon performed on Will Byers during his captivity within the Upside Down represented Henry's first successful attempt at establishing permanent psychic connections with earthbound consciousness through technological methods that paralleled the soteria device that had once constrained his own abilities. The slug-like organism that was inserted into Will's body served multiple functions simultaneously. It provided Henry with sensory access to events within the normal dimensional framework. It created biological dependencies that would make the host susceptible to external control, and it established communication channels that could be activated whenever dimensional gateways provided sufficient connectivity between parallel realities. The rescue of Will from dimensional captivity before the implantation process could achieve complete integration represented a significant setback for Henry's initial attempts at creating permanent agents within human civilization. Though the partial success of the biological modification provided valuable intelligence about the mechanisms required for more sophisticated control systems that could be implemented during future operations, the lingering effects of dimensional exposure that Will continued to experience following his return to normal reality demonstrated that even incomplete integration could create lasting vulnerabilities that might be exploited when circumstances permitted more direct intervention. The death of Barbara Holland during her captivity within the Upside Down served different strategic purposes than Will's survival, her elimination providing Henry with opportunities to study the metabolic processes through which consciousness could be absorbed and integrated into the collective intelligence networks that governed his dimensional domain. The knowledge gained through this experimentation would prove crucial for developing the consumption techniques that would characterize his later operations, when direct elimination of targets became preferable to attempting long-term control through biological implantation procedures. The psychic connection that the implanted organism established between Will and Henry operated according to principles that required active dimensional gateways to maintain communication channels across the space-time barriers separating their respective locations, creating conditions where Henry's influence over his unwilling agent could be activated and deactivated according to the status of portal networks that remained vulnerable to disruption by Earthbound authorities who possessed sufficient understanding of their function and strategic significance. The autumn of 1984 provided Henry with his first opportunity to test the effectiveness of his biological control systems when dimensional conditions aligned to permit sustained communication with the organism that had been implanted in Will during his previous captivity. The activation of this psychic link allowed Henry to access Will's sensory input while simultaneously beginning the process of gradually replacing his individual consciousness with collective intelligence patterns that would eventually transform him into fully functional extension of the hive. Mind networks that governed the Upside Down's social organization. The artistic expression that manifested during Will's period of psychic possession revealed the extent to which Henry's consciousness could influence Earthbound activities through biological control mechanisms. The drawings that emerged during these episodes reflecting not Will's natural creative abilities but direct transmission of visual information from the alien dimension where Henry's awareness was permanently stationed. The specific imagery that appeared in these drawings provided Earthbound observers with their first accurate intelligence about the organizational structures and strategic capabilities that characterized the interdimensional threat they were attempting to understand and counter. The Mind Flayer manifestation that began terrorizing Hawkins during this period represented not separate entity, but direct extension of Henry's consciousness, operating through atmospheric and biological systems that he had learned to control during his years of adaptation to the Upside Down's alien environment. The storm-like appearance and coordinated behavior patterns demonstrated his ability to project influence across dimensional boundaries, while maintaining the collective intelligence principles that had proven effective for controlling indigenous creatures within his dimensional domain. The thermal vulnerabilities that Earthbound defenders discovered during their confrontations with Mind Flayer manifestations reflected not accidental weaknesses, but strategic limitations that Henry had accepted in exchange for the enhanced mobility and coordinated control capabilities that atmospheric operation provided. The effectiveness of heat-based countermeasures against his projected consciousness suggested that his dimensional adaptation remained incomplete and that sustained operations within normal spacetime would require additional development of protective mechanisms. The closure of the dimensional gateway that terminated Henry's first major attempt at colonizing Earthbound territory demonstrated both the effectiveness of coordinated human resistance and the limitations of conducting complex operations through biological control systems that remained vulnerable to disruption through technological and psychic countermeasures. The severing of communication channels between dimensions forced him to abandon his partially successful infiltration of Hawkins, while simultaneously providing valuable intelligence about the defensive capabilities and strategic thinking that characterized his enemy's approach to supernatural threats. The pain that Henry experienced through the hive mind networks when Earthbound defenders eliminated demodogs that had been stranded by the gateway closure provided him with direct sensory feedback about the effectiveness of human bait countermeasures, while simultaneously suggesting modifications to his organizational structures that might reduce vulnerability to coordinated attacks in future operations. The shared consciousness that connected all entities within his dimensional domain created both strategic advantages and tactical liabilities that required careful management to maintain operational effectiveness. The Soviet infiltration of Hawkins during the summer of 1985 represented an unexpected opportunity for Henry to resume operations within Earthbound territory through methods that bypassed the security measures and defensive preparations that had proven effective during his previous attempt at establishing permanent influence within the community. The drilling operations conducted beneath Starcourt Mall created artificial dimensional instabilities that could be exploited to establish new gateway networks without requiring the kind of coordinated psychic energy that had characterized his earlier portal creation efforts. The international implications of Soviet research into supernatural phenomena confirmed Henry's growing understanding that Earthbound governments were engaged in systematic attempts to weaponize dimensional resources for conventional military purposes, creating opportunities for manipulation and misdirection that could be exploited to advance his own strategic objectives, while allowing human authorities to believe they were pursuing independent research programs rather than serving as unwitting agents of interdimensional influence. The decision to create physical manifestations within normal spacetime rather than relying on biological control of human subjects reflected Henry's growing confidence in his ability to project consciousness across dimensional boundaries, while simultaneously acknowledging the limitations that indirect influence imposed on tactical operations that required precision timing and coordinated implementation. The flesh-based constructions that began appearing in abandoned industrial facilities represented his first attempts at establishing permanent physical presence within Earthbound territory through methods that bypassed the presence-the-past vulnerabilities associated with biological implantation procedures. The selection of Billy Hargrove as the primary human agent for this phase of operations demonstrated Henry's sophisticated understanding of community psychology and the strategic advantages that could be gained through corrupting individuals whose social positions provided access to larger population groups that might be targeted for systematic infiltration or elimination. Billy's employment as lifeguard during peak summer recreational season created opportunities for contact with numerous potential victims, while his established personality patterns provided cover for behavioral changes that might result from dimensional influence. The warehouse facility where Henry established his primary operations center during the Starcourt Mall crisis provided the kind of industrial infrastructure necessary for large-scale biological manipulation while offering sufficient isolation to prevent premature discovery by authorities whose intervention might compromise operational security before strategic objectives could be achieved. The systematic transformation of captured humans into organic building materials for constructing larger manifestations demonstrated his growing mastery of techniques for converting individual consciousness into collective resources that served broader tactical purposes. The spider-like configuration that Henry imposed upon his physical manifestations during this period continued to reflect his childhood identification with predatory arachnids, while simultaneously demonstrating the extent to which his consciousness had been enhanced through dimensional adaptation to encompass organizational principles that exceeded anything available within earthbound biological systems. The massive scale of these constructions revealed capabilities that far exceeded his original telekinetic abilities, while suggesting that sustained operations within normal spacetime were becoming increasingly feasible despite the prize, energetic costs, and security risks that such activities necessarily entailed. The confrontation at Starcourt Mall that ended this phase of Henry's operations provided him with valuable intelligence about the defensive capabilities that his enemies had developed during the intervening years, while simultaneously confirming that coordinated resistance remained capable of disrupting his activities despite the enhanced resources and strategic advantages that dimensional adaptation had provided. The closure of the Soviet Gateway network forced him to abandon his physical manifestations while beginning preparations for more sophisticated approaches that would prove less vulnerable to the countermeasures that Earthbound defenders had proven capable of implementing when circumstances permitted coordinated response to supernatural threats. The emergence of Henry Creel's consciousness from dimensional exile into active predation within the Earthbound realm marked the beginning of the most sophisticated campaign of systematic elimination that human civilization had ever encountered, though the methods he employed during this phase would prove far more personal and psychologically devastating than the crude violence that had characterized his earlier attempts at reshaping reality according to his philosophical frameworks. The years spent mastering the collective intelligence networks of the Upside Down had provided him with insights into consciousness manipulation that exceeded anything available through conventional psychic abilities, allowing him to identify and exploit specific psychological vulnerabilities with precision that transformed individual human suffering into strategic weapons against entire communities. The astral projection capabilities that Henry had absorbed during his integration into the Mind Flayer consciousness enabled him to traverse dimensional boundaries without requiring permanent gateways, his awareness moving freely between parallel realities while his physical form remained safely concealed within the alien landscape that had become his permanent base of operations. This enhanced mobility allowed him to conduct reconnaissance operations that provided detailed intelligence about potential targets, while simultaneously maintaining the operational security that was essential for avoiding premature detection by authorities who had learned to recognize and respond to supernatural threats through their previous encounters with dimensional intrusions. The selection criteria that Henry developed for identifying ideal victims reflected his sophisticated understanding of human psychology, combined with strategic considerations about the maximum psychological impact that individual eliminations might achieve within targeted communities. The guilt and trauma that he sought in potential subjects served dual purposes, and these emotional states provided the psychic energy necessary for maintaining astral projection across dimensional boundaries while simultaneously ensuring that each kill would generate community-wide terror through the apparent targeting of individuals whose suffering seemed to validate broader fears about divine justice and cosmic retribution for hidden sins. The four-stage progression that characterized Henry's hunting methodology represented refinement of techniques he had first developed during his childhood experimentation on family members, though the enhanced capabilities and expanded understanding that dimensional exile had provided allowed him to implement psychological torture with precision and efficiency that exceeded anything he had previously achieved. The headaches that marked the initial stage of his predation served both practical and symbolic purposes, the physical pain alerting victims to supernatural attention, while simultaneously weakening their psychological defenses against more sophisticated forms of mental manipulation that would follow in subsequent phases. The nightmares that followed the onset of headaches demonstrated Henry's ability to penetrate and manipulate the unconscious mental processes that governed sleep and dream states. His intrusion into these vulnerable psychological territories, providing opportunities for implanting false memories and manipulating emotional associations that would enhance the effectiveness of subsequent torture sessions. The specific content of these dreams reflected his growing understanding of how individual trauma could be weaponized against victims whose guilt made them susceptible to believing that their suffering represented deserved punishment for moral failures that might otherwise remain private and manageable. The hallucinations that marked the third stage of Henry's predatory cycle represented his most sophisticated demonstrations of consciousness manipulation, the creation of convincing false sensory experiences that could not be distinguished from reality by victims whose psychological defenses had been systematically undermined through the previous phases of supernatural persecution. These fabricated experiences drew upon intimate knowledge of individual psychology that he had acquired through telepathic surveillance, ensuring that each hallucination carried maximum emotional impact, while simultaneously isolating victims from potential sources of support or intervention that might disrupt the final phase of his elimination process. The systematic nature of Chrissy Cunningham's psychological destruction revealed the extent to which Henry's methods had evolved beyond simple violence toward comprehensive dismantling of individual identity through targeted exploitation of the specific insecurities and traumas that defined her personal experience of existing within social systems that prioritized appearance over authentic self-expression. Her struggles with maternal pressure regarding body image provided perfect vulnerabilities for someone whose understanding of human psychology had been enhanced through decades of observing the institutional mechanisms that created and maintained artificial standards of acceptable behavior and appearance. The bathroom setting where Chrissy first encountered Henry's supernatural influence reflected his understanding of spaces where individuals felt most vulnerable to judgment and self-criticism. The mirrors and privacy of feminine hygiene facilities, creating environments where personal insecurities were most likely to manifest as conscious anxieties that could be detected and amplified through psychic intervention. The hallucination of her mother's voice, expressing disappointment and criticism, drew upon the authentic emotional patterns that characterized their actual relationship, while intensifying the psychological impact through supernatural presentation that bypassed rational analysis or defensive mechanisms. The decision to approach Eddie Munson for pharmaceutical assistance demonstrated how Henry's supernatural persecution could manipulate victims into making choices that would ultimately serve his strategic objectives while appearing to emerge from their own desperate attempts at self-medication and psychological relief. Chrissy's request for drugs that might alleviate her supernatural symptoms created the perfect circumstances for her final elimination, while simultaneously establishing Eddie as the primary suspect in what would appear to be conventional murder, despite the obviously impossible nature of the physical evidence that would be discovered at the scene. The trailer park setting where Chrissy met her death provided Henry with the kind of isolated environment necessary for implementing the final phase of his elimination process without risk of immediate discovery or intervention. While the social stigma associated with drug transactions in such locations would ensure that investigating authorities would focus on conventional criminal motives, rather than exploring supernatural explanations that might reveal the true nature of the threat facing their community. The timing of her death during Eddie's brief absence created perfect conditions for framing an innocent person while eliminating any potential witnesses who might provide testimony that contradicted official assumptions about the past. Circumstances surrounding her elimination. The telekinetic signature that characterized Chrissy's death matched the patterns that Henry had established during his original family massacre, though the enhanced precision and control that he demonstrated suggested that his capabilities had continued to develop during his dimensional exile in ways that made him far more dangerous than the troubled teenager who had first discovered his extraordinary abilities decades earlier. The systematic destruction of her body through focused application of invisible force created both the physical evidence necessary for terrorizing the broader community and the ritualistic satisfaction that his predatory nature required as compensation for years of frustrated desire to resume active operations against human civilization. Fred Benson's selection as the second victim reflected Henry's strategic understanding of how community psychology would respond to patterns of elimination that seemed to target specific demographic groups, while simultaneously appearing random enough to prevent effective, predictive countermeasures from being implemented by authorities who lacked adequate frameworks for understanding supernatural threats. The guilt that Fred carried regarding the automobile accident that had killed another passenger provided exactly the kind of emotional vulnerability that Henry's enhanced psychic abilities could exploit most effectively, while ensuring that his death would reinforce community fears about divine retribution for hidden sins. The newspaper office environment where Fred worked provided Henry with opportunities to observe and manipulate someone whose professional activities involved investigating and reporting on events that might eventually include his own predatory campaign, creating the possibility that eliminating this particular victim might simultaneously remove a potential source of accurate intelligence about supernatural activities while demonstrating his ability to reach targets regardless of their professional training in skepticism and factual analysis. The irony of a journalist becoming victim of phenomena that exceeded the explanatory frameworks available through conventional reporting added psychological satisfaction to the strategic benefits that Fred's elimination provided. The automobile accident that had originally traumatized Fred created perfect conditions for Henry's psychological manipulation, the survivor's guilt and trauma providing psychic energy for maintaining astral projection, while simultaneously ensuring that the victim would be isolated from potential sources of support through his inability to discuss the supernatural persecution without appearing to suffer from psychological disorders related to his previous traumatic experience. The specific imagery that Henry employed during Fred's final moments drew upon authentic memories of the accident, while amplifying the emotional impact through supernatural presentation that made rational analysis impossible. The death of Fred in an isolated outdoor location demonstrated Henry's ability to implement his elimination process regardless of environmental conditions or potential security considerations. His psychic abilities, allowing him to maintain complete control over victims whose consciousness had been sufficiently compromised through previous phases of supernatural persecution. The strategic timing of this kill reinforced patterns that would terrorize the community while simultaneously preventing authorities from developing effective countermeasures based on geographical or temporal analysis of the elimination sequence. Maxine Mayfield's selection as Henry's third intended victim represented both continuation of his established patterns and recognition that her connection to the previous supernatural crises made her particularly valuable as both target and potential source of intelligence about the Pomza's defensive capabilities that his enemies had developed during their previous encounters with dimensional threats. Her position within the social network that had successfully resisted his earlier operations provided opportunities for psychological manipulation that could potentially compromise the entire group's effectiveness, while simultaneously eliminating someone whose survival represented ongoing challenge to his authority and capabilities. The guilt that Max carried regarding Billy Hargrove's death during the Starcourt Mall incident provided Henry with perfect psychological leverage for implementing the kind of comprehensive identity destruction that had proven effective with previous victims, though her knowledge of supernatural phenomena and access to allies who understood the nature of dimensional threats would require modifications to his standard methodology that had not been necessary during previous eliminations. The complexity of her emotional relationships and support networks created both obstacles and opportunities for someone whose understanding of human psychology had been enhanced through decades of observation and experimentation. The investigative activities that Nancy Wheeler and Robin Buckley conducted at Penhurst Asylum represented the kind of intelligent response to supernatural threats that Henry had not anticipated based on his previous experiences with human reactions to unexplained phenomena. Their systematic approach to gathering intelligence about his origins and capabilities, demonstrating that at least some potential victims possessed the analytical skills and institutional knowledge necessary for developing effective countermeasures against his operations. The interview they conducted with Victor Creel provided them with crucial information about the music-based escape technique that would ultimately prove decisive during their attempt to save Max from supernatural elimination. Victor Creel's testimony about his own survival of Henry's childhood rampage revealed the existence of psychological defense mechanisms that could potentially be generalized into systematic countermeasures against astral projection attacks. Though the decades of institutional commitment and self-inflicted injury that had resulted from his encounter with supernatural phenomena demonstrated the severe psychological costs that such survival might entail, even under the best possible circumstances. The specific role that Ella Fitzgerald's music had played in breaking Henry's psychic control suggested that beloved melodies could serve as anchoring devices that maintained individual consciousness despite external attempts at manipulation and domination. The frantic search for Max's preferred music that occurred during her supernatural captivity demonstrated both the potential effectiveness of sonic countermeasures and the practical difficulties involved in implementing such defenses under emergency conditions when split-second timing could determine the difference between successful rescue and permanent elimination. The selection of Kate Bush's Running Up That Hill as her psychic lifeline reflected both personal taste and thematic appropriateness, the song's lyrics about exchanging places with someone else resonating with the sacrificial love that would ultimately prove more powerful than Henry's predatory philosophy. The moment when Max successfully escaped from Henry's psychic control represented his first significant tactical defeat since resuming active operations. The failure of his elimination process, revealing vulnerabilities in his methodology that had not been apparent during previous kills, when victims lacked both knowledge of supernatural threats and access to potential countermeasures. The music-based escape technique that saved her life provided his enemies with reproducible defense mechanisms, while simultaneously demonstrating that his enhanced capabilities remained subject to limitations that intelligent opposition might learn to exploit systematically. The selection of Patrick McKinney as his fourth intended victim reflected Henry's decision to continue implementing his original elimination sequence despite the tactical setbacks that Max's survival had created. Though the increased security precautions and community awareness that resulted from previous kills would require more sophisticated approaches to isolation and psychological manipulation than had been necessary during earlier phases of his campaign, the basketball player's athletic abilities and social connections created both obstacles and opportunities for someone whose predatory methods had been developed specifically for exploiting isolated and psychologically vulnerable individuals. The lake setting where Patrick met his death provided Henry with opportunities to demonstrate his ability to implement elimination procedures under circumstances where immediate rescue attempts were physically impossible. The aquatic environment, ensuring that potential witnesses would be unable to provide effective assistance while simultaneously creating dramatic visual presentations that would maximize the psychological impact of his successful kill on surviving observers. The specific timing of the attack while Patrick was swimming created perfect conditions for demonstrating supernatural capabilities while maintaining plausible deniability about the exact mechanisms through which his death had been achieved. The opening of the third-dimensional gateway that resulted from Patrick's elimination marked a crucial milestone in Henry's larger strategic plan for merging parallel realities. Though the increased attention from both local authorities and federal agencies that such obvious supernatural activity would inevitably generate created security risks that might compromise his ability to complete the final phase of his campaign before coordinated countermeasures could be implemented by enemies who were beginning to understand the systematic nature of his operations. Nancy Wheeler's capture and forced viewing of Henry's ultimate objectives represented his decision to abandon operational security in favor of psychological warfare. The revelation of his plan to destroy Hawkins through systematic gateway creation, serving both as intimidation tactic against his enemies and demonstration of the cosmic scope of his ambitions for reshaping reality according to principles that eliminated human civilization's capacity for independent existence. The specific imagery he provided of Hawkins, consumed by the Upside Down, served as both threat and promise. The vision of dimensional merger, representing completion of transformation processes that had begun with his childhood recognition of humanity's fundamental inadequacy for managing existence according to truly efficient principles. The decision to allow Nancy to survive this encounter and return with intelligence about his plans reflected Henry's growing confidence that human resistance would prove inadequate to prevent the completion of his strategic objectives, while simultaneously serving his psychological need for recognition and acknowledgement of the superior capabilities that his dimensional exile had provided. The message he instructed her to deliver to 11 represented both challenge and invitation. His assumption that their final confrontation would result in his ultimate victory over the only individual whose abilities might theoretically match his enhanced powers. The final confrontation that would determine the fate of not just Hawkins, but the fundamental relationship between parallel dimensions, began with unprecedented coordination between 3 separate theaters of operation, each representing different aspects of the resistance that had emerged to challenge Henry Creel's campaign for dimensional supremacy. The complexity of this multi-front assault reflected both the desperate circumstances that had driven former enemies into reluctant alliance and the growing understanding that conventional approaches to supernatural threats were inadequate when confronting entities whose capabilities transcended every category that human experience had prepared them to recognize or counter effectively. The mindscape battlefield, where Eleven projected her consciousness to intercept Henry's final assault on Max Mayfield, represented the most intimate and psychologically demanding aspect of the coordinated resistance, as her astral projection abilities would be tested against someone whose mastery of consciousness manipulation had been enhanced through decades of dimensional adaptation and integration with alien intelligence networks. The pizza shop freezer that served as her physical anchor during this psychic mission provided the kind of sensory deprivation necessary for maintaining astral projection across vast distances while simultaneously creating vulnerabilities that required absolute trust in her allies' ability to protect her physical form during the extended period when her awareness would be completely focused on events occurring within supernatural realms. The Russian facility where Jim Hopper, Joyce Byers, and Murray Bauman confronted the captive Demogorgons represented the most physically dangerous component of the coordinated assault. Their mission to eliminate creatures whose deaths would reverberate through the hive mind networks that connected all entities within Henry's dimensional empire. The flamethrower weapons they employed served dual purposes as both practical tools for destroying biological targets and symbolic instruments for purifying corruption that had spread beyond the boundaries of any single dimension to single dimension. Encompass networks of consciousness that operated according to principles hostile to individual human existence. The upside-down infiltration conducted by Nancy Wheeler, Robin Buckley, and Steve Harrington represented perhaps the most strategically crucial element of the three-pronged attack. Their mission to locate and destroy Henry's physical form while he was psychologically distracted by events occurring within the mindscape where his consciousness was engaged in battle with Eleven. The weapons they carried into this alien environment had been specifically modified to exploit the thermal vulnerabilities that previous encounters had revealed. Though the effectiveness of Earthbound technology against entities that had adapted to exist within dimensions governed by fundamentally different physical laws remained uncertain until tested under actual combat conditions. The synchronization required for coordinating attacks across multiple dimensions and combat theaters demanded communication capabilities that exceeded anything available through conventional technology. The success of their mission, depending upon intuitive understanding of timing and tactical coordination, that could only emerge through the deep personal bonds that had been forged during years of shared struggle against supernatural threats. The trust that each team member placed in their companion's abilities and judgment represented both their greatest strength and their most significant vulnerability, as failure by any single component of the coordinated assault could compromise the entire operation while exposing all participants to retaliation from an enemy whose vindictive nature had been demonstrated through decades of systematic revenge against those who had dared to oppose his ambitions. The moment when Eleven's consciousness materialized within Henry's mindscape marked the resumption of a conflict that had been interrupted by dimensional barriers but never truly resolved. Their confrontation, representing not just personal vendetta, but fundamental clash between competing visions of what human consciousness might become when freed from conventional limitations. The environment where their battle occurred reflected both combatants' memories and psychological associations. The familiar spaces of their shared institutional captivity transformed into battleground where the stakes involved not just individual survival, but the future relationship between parallel realities. Max's position within Henry's psychic construct served multiple strategic purposes. For someone whose understanding of psychological manipulation had been refined through decades of studying consciousness under extreme conditions. Her captivity, providing both the emotional leverage necessary for maintaining Eleven's engagement and the ritual component required for completing the dimensional merger that represented the culmination of his long-term strategic planning. The specific location where he had suspended her consciousness, surrounded by the remains of his previous victims, created symbolic resonance while simultaneously demonstrating the scope of destruction that his campaign had already achieved. The memory of the snowball dance that Max attempted to use as psychological refuge during Henry's assault represented her instinctive understanding of how beloved experiences could serve as anchoring points for individual identity when subjected to external attempts at consciousness manipulation, though her selection of this particular recollection would provide him with opportunities for demonstrating how even the most treasured memories could be corrupted through sophisticated application of psychic influence. The transformation of her happy memory into nightmare landscape reflected both his tactical understanding of psychological warfare and his philosophical commitment to eliminating the kind of sentimental attachments that he viewed as fundamental weaknesses in human psychological architecture. The intervention that saved Max from complete psychological destruction came not through her own defensive capabilities, but through Eleven's successful penetration of Henry's mindscape defenses. The arrival of her consciousness within his psychic construct, creating the kind of disruption that his strategic planning had not adequately anticipated, despite his intimate knowledge of her abilities and tactical preferences. The surprise that characterized this intervention reflected both the sophisticated camouflage that had concealed her approach and the limitations that even enhanced consciousness faced when attempting to monitor multiple theaters of operation simultaneously. The revelation of Eleven's true location and the pizza shop freezer that had enabled her astral projection created perfect opportunities for Henry to demonstrate the kind of casual omniscience that his dimensional adaptation had, provided while simultaneously expressing his contempt for the crude technological solutions that earthbound consciousness required for achieving capabilities that came naturally to beings who had transcended conventional limitations. The confusion that Max experienced upon encountering someone whose presence seemed impossible according to every framework she possessed for understanding reality reflected the broader inadequacy of human psychology for processing phenomena that operated according to principles beyond conventional space-time. The physical confrontation between Eleven and Henry within his mindscape construct tested both combatants' understanding of how consciousness could be weaponized against entities whose capabilities exceeded normal human limitations, their battle representing convergence of natural psychic development with artificially enhanced abilities that had been refined through completely different training methodologies and philosophical frameworks. The intensity of their conflict began to generate the kind of electromagnetic disturbances that could affect events occurring within adjacent dimensions, creating the conditions necessary for the coordinated assault that their allies were implementing within both earthbound and supernatural theaters of operation. The moment when Murray Bauman's flamethrower attack against the captive Demogorgons achieved sufficient damage to register within the hive mind networks that connected all entities under Henry's control marked the first successful exploitation of the collective consciousness that he had assumed would serve as unassailable advantage during any confrontation with earthbound resistance. The shared pain that reverberated through his distributed awareness created exactly the kind of distraction that Nancy, Robin, and Steve required for approaching his physical location without triggering the defensive responses that normally protected his vulnerable corporeal form during periods of astral projection. The vine networks that attempted to strangle the infiltration team as they approached Henry's sanctuary within the Creel House attic represented the automated defensive systems that he had established to protect his physical form during extended periods of consciousness projection, though the biological nature of these security measures created vulnerabilities that could be exploited through the same thermal weapons that had proven effective against other creatures within his dimensional empire. The coordinated nature of their attack demonstrated understanding of hive mind psychology that exceeded his expectations regarding earthbound intelligence capabilities. Their systematic elimination of defensive organisms creating cascade failures throughout his security networks. The discovery of Henry's physical location within the attic of his childhood home provided perfect symbolic closure for a campaign that had begun with family massacre in the same building decades earlier, though the extensive biological modifications that connected his corporeal form to the alien consciousness networks governing the Upside Down created tactical challenges that conventional weapons would have been unable to address effectively. The apparatus of vines and organic connections that sustained his physical existence while his consciousness operated within psychic realms represented both life support system and vulnerability that earthbound attackers might potentially exploit if they possessed sufficient understanding of the mechanisms involved. The flamethrower assault that Nancy, Steve, and Robin conducted against Henry's suspended physical form achieved the kind of coordinated timing that could only result from months of tactical planning and perfect trust in their companions' abilities. Their attack synchronized with the psychic battle occurring within the mindscape, where Eleven's confrontation with Henry's consciousness was reaching climactic intensity. The thermal damage that their weapons inflicted created exactly the kind of physical trauma that hive mind psychology was designed to share among all connected entities, ensuring that Henry's awareness would be flooded with pain signals that disrupted his ability to maintain control over either the psychic battle or his distributed consciousness networks. The moment when Henry's concentration faltered due to physical trauma marked the turning point in Eleven's psychic battle against his consciousness. The distraction created by earthbound attacks allowing her to break free from the restraints he had imposed, while simultaneously providing opportunities for renewed assault against someone whose attention was divided among multiple theaters of simultaneous combat. The telekinetic force that she unleashed during this crucial moment represented not just personal desperation, but strategic recognition that coordinated resistance had created the only opportunity they were likely to receive for eliminating a threat whose capabilities would continue to grow if allowed to survive and adapt to their current countermeasures. The attempt that Henry made to escape from the burning attic through telekinetic flight demonstrated both his remaining capabilities and the extent to which physical trauma had compromised his ability to coordinate supernatural abilities with tactical awareness, his retreat creating the kind of apparent victory that would satisfy immediate tactical objectives while potentially allowing his survival and eventual return with enhanced understanding of human defensive capabilities. The fall from the second-story window that concluded this phase of combat created perfect conditions for the mysterious disappearance that would characterize his apparent elimination, though the absence of a body would leave crucial questions unanswered regarding the true effectiveness of their coordinated assault. The fourth chime that resonated through both dimensions as Max's clinical death activated the final gateway in Henry's dimensional merger plan represented the ultimate irony of their apparent victory, the success of their rescue mission occurring simultaneously with the completion of his long-term strategic objectives for creating permanent connections between parallel realities. The massive fault line that began tearing Hawkins apart served as physical manifestation of dimensional boundaries that had been permanently compromised through the systematic elimination campaign that their intervention had been unable to prevent, despite the tactical victories they had achieved during individual battles. The desperate attempt that Eleven made to revive Max through telekinetic manipulation of her cardiac and respiratory systems represented both personal devotion and strategic recognition that preventing Henry's complete victory might require techniques that transcended conventional understanding of the relationship between consciousness and biological function. The success of her improvised medical intervention demonstrated capabilities that exceeded everything she had previously achieved, while simultaneously raising questions about the long-term consequences of using psychic abilities to interfere with fundamental biological processes that governed the boundary between life and death. The comatose state in which Max survived following her clinical death and supernatural resurrection created conditions that satisfied neither complete victory nor total defeat. Her suspended consciousness existing in liminal space between dimensions, while her physical form remained anchored within earthbound medical facilities that lacked adequate frameworks for understanding or treating patients whose survival had been achieved through supernatural intervention. The partial success of Eleven's rescue efforts provided hope, while simultaneously demonstrating the limitations that even extraordinary abilities faced when confronting threats that operated on cosmic scales beyond individual comprehension. The fault line that continued to expand through Hawkins despite Henry's apparent defeat served as permanent reminder that their tactical victories had occurred within the context of strategic failure, the dimensional merger that he had sought having been achieved through methods that their resistance had been unable to prevent. Despite understanding his objectives and implementing sophisticated countermeasures designed to disrupt his systematic elimination campaign, the ongoing expansion of supernatural influence within their community represented the beginning of new challenges that would require different approaches and enhanced capabilities if human civilization hoped to survive the fundamental changes that Henry's activities had initiated. The fires that consumed significant portions of the town during the dimensional merger process created both practical obstacles for survivors attempting to rebuild their community and symbolic representation of the purification that Henry had always insisted was necessary for eliminating the corrupt elements that prevented human civilization from achieving its true potential. The destruction that accompanied his partial success demonstrated both the scope of his ambitions and the terrible costs that resistance to cosmic-level threats would inevitably entail, regardless of the courage and sophistication that earthbound defenders brought to their struggle against entities whose capabilities transcended conventional understanding. The aftermath of their confrontation revealed that apparent victory against supernatural threats could coexist with strategic defeat in ways that made traditional concepts of success and failure inadequate for evaluating the true consequences of their actions. The survival of individual community members occurring within the context of fundamental alterations to reality that would reshape every aspect of existence for anyone who remained within the affected geographical area. The knowledge that Henry's consciousness might have survived his physical destruction created ongoing security concerns that would require constant vigilance and continued development of countermeasures against threats whose nature exceeded every category that human experience had prepared them to recognize or effectively address through conventional methods. The dimensional barriers that remained permanently compromised following the merger process created conditions where future supernatural crises would be inevitable regardless of the defensive preparations and tactical capabilities that survivors might develop during periods of apparent peace and recovery. The gateway networks that Henry had established through systematic murder would continue to influence events within both dimensions while providing opportunities for renewed attempts at conquest by entities whose patient nature made Decades or centuries seem like brief interludes in campaigns, designed to reshape reality according to principles that acknowledge no authority beyond perfect efficiency and absolute control over all forms of consciousness within their expanding sphere of influence. And so we conclude this chronicle of corruption, the complete transformation of Henry Creel from troubled child to interdimensional destroyer. His journey reminds us that monsters are not born but made, shaped by trauma, isolation, and the terrible choices we make when pain becomes our compass. Though his body may have fallen from the Creel house window, his influence continues to spread through the fault lines that now divide Hawkins between worlds. The gates remain open, the upside down bleeds into reality, and somewhere in the darkness, Vecna waits. But perhaps in understanding his origin, we find hope, for if monsters can be made, then heroes can be forged as well. Let these tales of darkness guide you toward peaceful dreams, knowing that even in our sleeping hours, love proves stronger than hate, and the bonds we forge with others can withstand any supernatural storm. Rest now, dear listeners, in the knowledge that morning always follows the longest nights, and that some battles, once won, make all the difference.